The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion with author and former White House counsel John Dean. Join us as In-Depth welcomes the author of 10 books, including Lost Honor, Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush, and Pure Goldwater. His most recent book is an updated edition of Blind Ambition, The White House Years.
John Dean, among your 10 books, Pure Goldwater, co-written by Barry Goldwater's son. And in the book, you compare Barry Goldwater to Harry Truman. How so?
Well, he's one of those guys who has, over the years, his positions have gotten forgotten, his specifics, and he's really become to be viewed by partisans on both sides as somebody who was really a straight shooter, who told it the way it was, who had the respect of a wide spectrum. And I think as history has passed, he is in that category, regardless of whether you agreed or disagreed with him at the time. You look at him now as somebody who really had the best interest of the country in mind and spoke his mind, and that has a certain charm and certain good reception with the average voter. So I think there's a nice comparison.
And as you write, admired for his principles, is there somebody on the national stage today that is a Barry Goldwater?
I'm looking for him. I'm not sure there is. There are people who speak their mind, but he became a unique figure in American politics because of his outspokenness and his. He took a very unpopular position at the time. Conservatism was very young when he started a movement. And made it very sensible. It was very common sense conservatism. We don't have somebody who's starting a movement quite like that I see today, at least hasn't surfaced on my radar.
When did you first meet Barry Goldwater?
When I was 13 years old. His son and I were roommates in prep school. We would travel up here to Washington from Stanton, Virginia, where we were in school. We would visit with him. It was very impressive. You know, here was this very tall, handsome, figure who you'd walk down the Senate corridors with him, and he'd be kind of create a wake with the various police people and other people giving him way. He'd take us around the Senate. He drove a 1957 at that time Thunderbird that was geared up like it was the cockpit of an airplane. It had more gadgets and stuff. So for teenage boys, and being a teenager, he was a man's man and a great figure and a very charismatic person for a young guy.
One of the other words that comes up a lot in Pure Goldwater is honesty. Explain.
Well, Pure Goldwater, to put it in context, is just that. I'd read the senator's autobiographical works where he had worked with co-authors, and I don't think they ever found this material. And years later, in talking to him, he had told me he'd taken a lot of material that he had composed over the years and put it in the Arizona Historical Foundation. I hadn't seen that in his books, and when he and I were going to do another project, I looked at that and realized at that time, I said, you know, there's really good stuff in here, and it is pure Goldwater because it's not by a speechwriter, it's not by a staff person, it's the senator, and it goes from everything from a personal diary he kept starting when his son died, or excuse me, when his son was born, until his own death. And it's not regular, but it's enough of it that you really get a sense of the man through a lot of years. It's very personal. He hammered it out on a little portable typewriter when he was first starting it. Later, when electronic dictation became available, he would dictate it and it would be transcribed. And it wasn't well filed initially, but the archivist got it in order. And when I looked at it, I said to Barry Jr., I said, you know, this tells more about your dad, I think, in many ways than the autobiographies he's done. And it is, you know, we get his sense of humor, we get his position on various figures in politics. The surprise to me was the depth of the material on Nixon I found in the book, which I was very surprised with. It's the subject his diary got the most attention for. So it made an interesting work to to put it together, given the fact it was so original.
I want to get to the Nixon material in just a moment. Just to put it in context, Barry Goldwater elected back in 1952. He ran for the presidency and so gave up his Senate seat in 1964, and then came back in 1968, was elected, and served for another 18 years.
Right.
But he ran in 1964 knowing that he was going to lose to Lyndon Johnson. Why?
A matter of principle in many regards. He had been visiting the South, giving a lot of speeches in the South, realized there was a whole body of thought down there and a number of people whose views weren't really getting expressed through the Democratic Party at that time. They liked him, he liked them, and he thought it was time for the Republicans to make some serious inroads into the South. The part his diary is the weakest on is the material regarding the '64 campaign. That's the smallest bit of the material. In fact, we found some letters. We decided not to use the letters because they weren't quite the same as the diary entries. Just a few of those where he was a little bitter at the end. He thought that the press treatment was pretty rough in '64. If you recall, there was a lawsuit that he was provoked after '64 because a group of psychiatrists got together and polled. One person polled all psychiatrists, and they said he was psychologically unfit to be president. He didn't much take to that, so he decided to file a defamation suit. And I used a little bit of the deposition in that case in the book because, again, it was pure Goldwater coming out. So I think he ran in '64, to answer your question, to make some points, to lay a predicate for what would later become the conservative movement and would be followed up by Ronald Reagan. And without Goldwater in '64, you wouldn't have had Ronald Reagan later.
You compare the style of Richard Nixon after he lost in 1962 when he ran for governor of California to the statement of Barry Goldwater in 1964. And in the statement he said, quote, "I'd never seen or heard in my life," going back to the issue of the media, "such vitriolic, unbiased attacks on one man as had been directed to me. I've never in my life seen such inflammatory language as been used by some men who know better. I think these people, for their frankly shoddy behavior, should hang their head in shame because I think they've made the Fourth Estate a sorry, sad mess."
I think the only thing that would differ from what Nixon said is you don't have Barry Goldwater to kick around anymore. He didn't add that. He was very, very upset. In fact, he famously said, you know, if I had to vote for the Goldwater who was portrayed in the media in '64, I wouldn't have voted for him. He said, that wasn't me. I didn't recognize the character that the media portrayed. So he had a very tough time in '64 with the media, and he was provoked at that post-election press conference to lay it out for what it was.
He loved his typewriter, didn't he?
He loved it was actually a little portable typewriter. He would take it out on his camping trips with him. Typed pretty well, but we had found a few errors we had to correct. But he actually it got much fuller when he was able to dictate.
There are two entries I want to ask you to elaborate on. One is from January 27th, 1971. And he's writing about Richard Nixon. This is in his diary, not a letter to the then president. "Looking back over the past several months, I continue to be amazed at the ineptitude that President Nixon has shown in the operation of government. This amazes me because if there is a politically astute animal in American politics, it is Dick Nixon," said Barry Goldwater. "I believe the trouble to be in that he has allowed himself to be surrounded by people who really aren't too smart in the field of politics, so he does not know what is going on."
He shared with his diary his thoughts, many of which he had actually shared with the president in some of their conversations. He stayed with Nixon, as we all know, right up until the end, and then some. After Nixon went to San Clemente, and he would go out and visit him in San Clemente, trying to see how his temperature was. And it's very late in the game that Barry Goldwater finally breaks rank with Richard Nixon, because Nixon is really trying to cause a hard time for Jerry Ford when Ford was going to run for president. And Goldwater got disgusted. He said, you know, this man's been lying to me for a long time, and I've had it. And they just broke, and after that, there was never any relationship further.
In a letter that he wrote to Richard Nixon, June 20th, 1973, still very much supportive of the president, he began by saying, "Dear Mr. President, frankly, I think I should start over by saying Dear Dick, because I'm writing to myself, as you will quickly detect." And it was a letter that he penned on his typewriter, talked about the people surrounding him in the White House, and also said, you need to come to Congress. People in Congress need to know that their president is listening to them. He also mentions Watergate in this letter. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, that was a private letter he typed out, literally at his apartment, and got it to the president. He did not get a response to it. So it was not a successful effort. At that point, Nixon had withdrawn pretty deeply into himself, and I'm sure someone like Al Haig looked at that letter and said, well, that's just going to upset the president worse. We better not get that in.
And it's a long letter.
It is a long letter, and it lays out a lot of thoughts. And he was, Goldwater at that point is trying to give the president his seasoned advice of how to proceed. But those of us on the other side and know that part of the story realize that Nixon knew by then there was very little he could do to salvage the situation.
In your book, The Rehnquist Choice, you write that more than any other president since FDR, he, Richard Nixon, worked hard to mold the court to his political liking. How did the Rehnquist decision fit into that?
Well, of course, the Rehnquist book, I hadn't reread it. I decided, having done a book for Brian Lamb on this show, the Harding book, and he caught me on a fact I couldn't remember. I should actually reread my books before I visited with you. I did, and I really enjoyed the Rehnquist book because it's a book that disappeared. It came out the week before 9/11, and as a result of not having Osama or terrorism in the title, like all books at that time, just disappeared. Maybe one of my best books. It's the one that historians write me the most about because it's based literally on the tapes that occurred in the Oval Office between Nixon and people talking about the staff. And when I'm not in there or others are not in there, I was able to put together a remarkable story, which is very timely now because we're about to, the potential is very real. We're going to put another justice or two on the court. In the fall of '71, Nixon has 2 seats to fill. And the story I tell, and call it the Rehnquist Choice, a little bit for a literary device, because Rehnquist doesn't come up until the very end of the book. He is selected in the last 24 hours of the process, much to Rehnquist's surprise, who was doing at Justice somewhat what I was doing at the White House. He was developing candidates. He was doing preliminary vetting. The White House was getting upset with the fact they were being sent candidates like Hainsworth and Carswell, who were rejected by the Senate, were not well vetted candidates. So the White House and Ehrlichman, my predecessor as White House counsel, had gotten into it. The president had gotten into it. But it was still pretty much Mitchell and Nixon. And Barry Goldwater, for example, called in at one point. He can't remember Rehnquist's name, but he said, there's this guy you've got working for you, Mr. President, who's the president's lawyer who you should think about. Nixon understands who he's talking about. So he's dropped in, but it's ignored. Rehnquist is selected because I happen to have worked at the Department of Justice too. Nixon was desperate to find a true conservative to put on the court. And they were scrambling. It shows as refined as you might think that process is, it's a lot of catch as catch can. It's a lot of who's available, who can we get confirmed at a given time. So this book sort of walks a reader through how that process unfolded with a record the likes of which we'll never have, because no president's ever going to tape again. But anyway, Rehnquist was my candidate. Because I knew Bill, I knew his conservatism, I knew why he believed the way he did. I was frankly later shocked to the degree of his conservatism, and I thought he would actually be a little bit more moderate on the court than he turned out to be. But that's another story. But there was a right time, and I suggested to several staff. Then I happened to mention another guy who just happened to walk into Nixon's office and he has selected, and he's got in his mind Howard Baker and Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell would, of course, be nominated, but Howard Baker is dithering. He can't decide whether he wants to go on the court or not. Howard Baker, for listeners who might have forgotten, was the minority leader of the Senate, a fairly young minority leader at that, and somebody who Nixon thought would make a good justice, and probably would have. But we later learned that Baker, he had kids he had to put through college. He was worried about the finances of a job like that, which still doesn't pay well. It's a real sacrifice for a lot of men to go on the high court. So I had suggested Rehnquist to Dick Moore. Dick Moore happens to go in and get into a conversation with Nixon, who at this point is holding this very close to the chest. And so Rehnquist, the name gets thrown in. And while he's been thinking about it, it's not until Richard Moore mentioned something I'd mentioned to Moore that Rehnquist had clerked as a law clerk for Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson is a great justice by any partisan's definition, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Nixon recognized that. That seemed to close the deal. Suddenly he's not very interested in Baker. And then when he learns that Rehnquist, they thought, was number 2 in his class, again, Moore had that wrong. He was number 1 in his class. And Nixon had been beat up a little bit for some of the people he suggested along the way. So that was a fascinating story to put together, how Rehnquist did get the nomination. The problem with the book, and the last end of the book, is Rehnquist was never vetted for the job. And that created its own set of problems.
And yet, in one reference, you or somebody else describes Rehnquist as a clown based on his attire.
Nixon. That's Nixon. That's a much earlier situation. After the Pentagon Papers were released, it brought to Nixon's mind again the fact that there's so much overclassification of documents in government. He wanted to create a pretty high-level group that would address and tackle the problem of declassifying papers. So what he did is he selected a small panel, put Bill Rehnquist in charge of that. He'd never met Bill Rehnquist, and we were having a conference in the outer office of his executive office building in their conference room. He comes in because he wants to charge the group up and tell him what he's got in mind, why he wants these papers declassified. And Rehnquist does a little talk and so on and so forth. And on the way out, the president signals me to follow him. And he says to me, he said, "John, who's the clown who's leading the meeting?" And I said, well, I don't know what you mean, Mr. He said, well, he knows I'm a little baffled by he thinks he's a clown. Well, he's got these long, at that point he had very long sideburns, and he was wearing hush puppies. We hadn't seen a lot of hush puppies in the corridors of the White House. And so, and Bill wore some of the worst neckties I've ever seen. Obviously it helped him wearing robes a lot when he was a judge, because they just seemed to be clashing choices, and so Nixon reacted to that. And he also said, "Is he Jewish?" And I said, "No, Mr. President, I think he's Scandinavian." And he shook his head and he just kind of walked off in his office. And he couldn't remember his name after that. He comes up later and he calls him Rehnquist or something like that. And Ehrlichman at that time, who was one of his classmates at Stanford, corrected him. So he didn't know well the man he appointed, and probably, I think, when he left the presidency, thought that might have been one of his greatest decisions.
In the book Conservatives Without a Conscience, is conservatism a movement or is it an ideology?
It's both. It is at least an ideology. One of the things I tried to do in that book was to get a good definition, a good working definition of conservatism. And I talked to, I can't tell you how many conservatives. I looked at the work of conservative intellectuals, and if there's anything they seem to agree upon, particularly the more intellectuals, is that you can't define adequately conservatism. And so they don't try to do so. Bill Buckley has thrown out some rather obtuse definitions. Other scholars have raised the problem of the difficulty of defining it. Barry Goldwater actually is somebody who cranked out 3 columns a week for 4 years for the LA Times, came up with a good, certainly for a politician, working definition that he thought was, where it's drawing on the values of the past, the best of them, and applying them to the present. But he never really did come up with a totally satisfactory definition. But it became a movement. There's no question. Those aren't incompatible, that you don't have a definition, but you develop a movement, because I think it's, as much as anything, an attitude. In the book, for example, I try to give a broad spread for people, particularly those who don't know anything about conservatism. Most conservatives I talk to, agree with this, the difficulty of defining it. But there are, I think it more of an attitude in many regards and an approach than an ideology. So I don't think it has the typical traits of an ideology, but the movement obviously is something that has gained steam since the 50s and is still evolving as we see it in its latest iteration in the Tea Party movement.
Our conversation, 3 hours in depth here on C-SPAN 2's Book TV with John Dean, who served as counselor to President Nixon, has written 10 books, and will be with us to take your phone calls, 202-737-0001 if you live in the Eastern and Central time zones. And for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. Our email address is booktv@cspan.org, and you can join the conversation online at twitter.com. Let's talk about Watergate. Well, let's actually go back to the moment that you were asked to serve as counselor to the president. Was it a job that you wanted?
I was totally surprised. Bud Krogh, who worked for John Ehrlichman, asked me to come over to the White House, and we ended up walking around by the ellipse, and he said, Ehrlichman has moved out of the counsel's chair, and there's a big discussion internally in the White House about who's going to become the counsel, and I've been asked to ask if you are interested in the job. I said, well, it's obviously a great job, Bud, but I had a lot of friends, including you, at the White House, and you guys, you work around the clock and you see very little satisfaction. I'm over at Justice. I enjoy my job. I happened at that point to know about where I stood in the Department of Justice. They have something called, we saw it in 9/11 actually, when there's a threat to the government, there's our emergency government procedures, and you can all get whisked off into great caves at the top of the Department of Justice. And when I looked at the memo describing where I was in the ranking, I realized if 12 persons in the office didn't make it, I would become Attorney General. So I was ranked number 13th at a fairly young age. And John Mitchell had told me, he said, you're going to get, there are going to be higher options for you here at the Justice Department. When I mentioned the feeler to both Mitchell and Kleindienst, they both discouraged me from going to the White House for that very reason. They said, we'd like to keep you here at the department. We like your work, and we think you'll find yourself going up the ladder.
What was the relationship like between John Mitchell and Richard Nixon over the years?
At that point, it was very close. Mitchell had been Nixon's law partner in New York. They had been in 2 firms that have merged. They met. Nixon liked Mitchell. That's why he had become the campaign manager in the '68 race. He found that Mitchell knew people, politicians, state, local, all over the country as a result of doing Wall Street bonds for state and municipal governments. He was a wonderful contact for that reason. He wasn't a particularly political animal in that sense, like for a presidential race, but Nixon always virtually ran his own campaigns. So when he became Attorney General, when he became President, Nixon had to convince Mitchell to become Attorney General. It wasn't a job he sought. I think he wanted to stay on Wall Street. He was making a very handsome living. I don't think John was sure how Martha might adjust to his wife would fare in Washington. She actually became a great personality, and she loved it, but it also would destroy their marriage. So it was a close relationship. When I I remember Dick Kleindienst. I worked in the Deputy Attorney General's office. I was the Associate Deputy Attorney General, and Kleindienst said, you know, there's nobody who's going to have more influence with this president than John Mitchell, and that was true. He was on a lot of the key committees at the White House. He was somebody who would go over and try to give the president straight advice. The closest I ever got to hearing how they interacted was when I listened to the tapes on the selection of the two empty chairs on the Supreme Court. And by that time, Mitchell's relationship with Nixon has become strained. One of the ways, and I do this in particularly when I did the new addition to Blind Ambition, my first book, I added an addendum. I added a section because you can't understand Watergate without understanding the personalities. Anybody that thinks that personalities don't get in the way. And there became a real conflict between John Mitchell and John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman, another lawyer, was trying to set domestic advice. The only department he had no influence over was Justice because of Mitchell's real impact with the president. And this bothered Ehrlichman, didn't bother Mitchell because he had control of it. But with time, and after mistakes were made, let's stay with Haynsworth and Carswell. They were disastrous nominees for the court. I mean, Haynsworth should have made it. Carswell would have never been a very good justice in the best day. And then more bad recommendations came over. So this gave Ehrlichman tremendous leverage. As we'll get into in Watergate, there were even more serious problems where the hard feeling between these two men that I gather, and I wasn't in the campaign in '68, went back that far, where they really were at odds on a number of issues, came to play and influenced the president, and I think hurt the presidency for the worst.
We're talking with John Dean, his latest book, Blind Ambition, with the rest of the story that came out in 2009. Jay is joining us from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Welcome to the program, Jay.
Thank you. Mr. Dean, I saw you down here a couple years ago when you were doing your last book signing, and I wondered if you're coming back again. But my primary question was, incidentally, I'd gone to Stanton Military Academy with you. And my question was, you were obviously aware of the Watergate break-in before it happened. Did you forewarn the president that it would come to nobody's interest except possibly the Democratic parties?
Well, let me tell you about that. What had happened is that I was asked, because Jeb Magruder, the head of the re-election committee, was not terribly familiar with Mitchell, asked me to come over and hear what Gordon Liddy's plans for political intelligence might be. Two of the most amazing meetings I'd ever attended in government. Liddy was over there to make a pitch. He had easels set up in the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General, Mitchell, planning to come over to run the campaign. I listened to this pitch. For example, he said he had it all in code names. He said, you know, Mr. President, I have plans, for example, to deal with the anti-war demonstrators, which was one of our real problems. He'd been told, you know, for example, my office got anti-war demonstration information because it was government and classified information. We couldn't give it to the campaign, so they had to have their own capabilities. So I was curious to see what Liddy'd set up. And I listened to Liddy, and he said, well, General Mitchell, what we can do is we will kidnap the anti-war demonstrators, and we will drug them and take them below the Mexican border. Years later, I was talking to one of the lawyers who represented the anti-war leaders, and he said to me, John, what Liddy didn't realize is a lot of these guys would have liked to have been drugged and taken below the Mexican border. But he had other plans. For example, he was going to hire a chase plane that would intercept ground-to-air communications between the opponent's campaign plane. He was going to me, the only point I sort of interjected myself is he told Mitchell, you know, we also have a plan on how to get intelligence from the Democrats in their Miami convention. And what we're going to do is we have leased a houseboat that has a two-way mirror, and we will make films of what's happening inside. And what we're going to do to get people inside is we have hired some prostitutes, and we're going to get them to go out and infiltrate the Democrats at their watering spots down here at the Miami Convention in '72, lure them into the houseboat, and then we'll get them in some compromising and informative information. At that point, I'm sitting in the Attorney General's office with Jeb Magruder, and I turned to both Liddy and Magruder, and I say, Gordon, you got to be kidding. This isn't even real. And Liddy, who became quite annoyed with me, snapped his heels and turned to Mitchell and said, John, or General, I can assure you these are the finest girls from Baltimore. And so he was quite confident he had the talent to handle it. And it went on like that. It was quite an amazing meeting. I knew that Mitchell, when he got to the bottom line, was going to reject it. He said, this is going to cost you $1 million. And Mitchell said, well, Gordon, this isn't quite what I have in mind. We're more interested in the anti-war problem, protecting the re-election committee, the surrogates we're going to send out, and so why don't you go back to the drawing board? He realizes today he should have thrown a man out of the window. I came back to a second meeting, and I really arrived late. I now today know from looking at calendars in the archives that I actually visited with Bob Haldeman after both the first and second meeting to tell Haldeman the craziness I was learning about. I went to the second meeting late, heard them talking about electronic surveillance, and I said, listen, I apologize for being late. I don't know what you've talked about, but I do know that this conversation isn't something that should be occurring in the office of the Attorney General. So I threw cold water on it. I never thought it would go further than that. I remember Liddy and I talking about something afterwards. He said, well, you know, I understand what you're saying, John. The President needs, or the Attorney General needs deniability. You need deniability. I won't talk to you ever again about it. I said, that's exactly the way I want it. So I went back and reported that to Haldeman. And he said, John, you should have nothing to do with this, which I didn't. And it isn't until after many months later, when Liddy's men are arrested in the Watergate, that I learned, you know, I'm able to put together the pieces very quickly, and I learned that Mitchell has approved the plan down in Miami. It's down to $250,000, but it's very clear. And in writing the addendum I added to Blind Ambition, after many years and some unique situations in litigation, I've obtained a lot more information, and it's quite clear while Nixon never ordered the Watergate break-in. I don't believe anybody in the White House knew about the Watergate break-in. It's very clear that Nixon was asking for information. At about the only place you could get it was inside the Watergate. They learned about a kickback scheme the Democrats were planning at their Miami convention, whereby advertisers would come in the various lobbies and locations and pay for the space, and that would come back into the Democratic Party, not as campaign money from contributions or from corporations, which were outlawed, but just a vehicle to funnel some money into the Democratic Party. That's what they were looking for in the DNC. They were looking for financial information. And you find it both in documents that I have come across, and you find it on the tapes, both before the Watergate break-in was discovered and after, and it's pretty revealing. I'm sure there'll be more tapes found over time. These are just happen to be tapes I've spent over the years and you know, a couple decades, and I say, my goodness, you know, including some conversations of my own where I didn't really understand what the president was asking me.
Just as an aside, the story that you just outlined from the girls of Baltimore and the situation in Miami Beach, characterized by Martin Sheen in the movie Blind Ambition. Right. Did he capture this?
I think pretty well. I worked with the screenwriter. He based it on the book, and I think they had a pretty good sense of what was going on in there.
From Randy Rohrabach.
You have a clip for it?
No, we don't, but I just, we had the photograph we just showed our audience of you with Martin Sheen on the set.
Oh, well, yeah, we went out to visit during the filming.
Randy Rohrbeck, who says that he's 60 years old. He remembers being glued to the TV during the Watergate hearings. He, as an aside, said that you and Mr. Butterfield stole the show. But he had two questions. First of all, please comment on whether the Watergate fiasco should teach us anything about where the line between transparency and secrecy should be drawn in governing the country.
Well, I think it taught us a lot, and it's a lesson we seem to have forgotten. We remembered it for a long time, and one of the reasons I wrote a number of books about the Bush administration is because it became so conspicuous. We were not only had forgotten, we were trying to reverse any of the impact Watergate had had on the presidency and transparency and the way the three branches should operate. There's no question that accountability is indispensable in a democracy, and you can't do it behind closed doors. So and that's one of the, if there's anything that helped, two things helped foster Watergate was one, having too much money in the campaign system, and secondly, secrecy. I'd be the first to tell you that no president can govern without privacy. There's a difference between privacy and secrecy. Secrecy is the intent to hide. Privacy is the need to make decisions in a way that doesn't interfere with your decision-making process. So I think it was one of the lessons, and it was in place for a long time. Cheney came in with a very clear mission to try to reverse all of what he thought had happened to the presidency as a result of Watergate. I'm not one who never thought the presidency was weakened a second, and if anything, it was strengthened because of Watergate. And he just didn't like the fact that the Congress had gained some power of its own for oversight and things like this, and has done his best, did his best to obliterate them.
And that book, of course, Worse Than Watergate.
That gave me the title Worse Than Watergate.
Let me go back to the second point from Randy in Connecticut. Fantasy, I know, but in what major ways would the world look differently today had Nixon not been caught or behaved dishonorably?
Fascinating historical counterfactual. I'm not sure I could spin it all the way out. You know, first of all, I don't think that anybody in the Nixon White House, with maybe one exception, was particularly evil. I think they were all good men with good intentions. They were trying to do the best to run the country.
Who's the exception?
G. Gordon Liddy. I just think Gordon has got the screws all confused in his brain, and just never seemed to, you know, he's just totally misguided in trying to sell the half-baked approaches he believed should be permissible, and they're all beyond the law. You know, you just don't, the law is irrelevant, and I just don't think you can be, or the fact that you should remain silent after you make a mistake. I don't think the code of the mafia should be the norm for White House aides. So I just have, you know, I could go through a whole litany of activities where I just think Liddy has evidenced some signs of a very distorted, if not evil, personality.
And you filed a lawsuit against him.
Oh yes, but that's another story. Let me. Where were we on the other one? You wanted to.
Had Nixon served two full terms?
Right.
How would the world look differently?
How different it would have been. Well, there's no question that the biggest thing that got set aside that Nixon was working on for his second term was a rather major reorganization of the executive branch. He realized he could never get the legislation through the Congress, because when you reorganize the executive branch, you affect the congressional committees that have oversight over those particular administrative agencies or departments and what have you. So he had divined a system that my office worked on. I had people from the Department of Justice working on it. Ehrlichman had worked on it and had been in the works many months. And it would have radically redesigned and modernized, if you will, more into a functional area, all the departments and agencies that have grown up over the years. In other words, national security is all over the lot. The national security community, which is one of the largest in the executive branch, ranges from the intelligence agency spread out to the Department of Defense, the Department of State, Now some of it's in Homeland Security, an agency that didn't even exist before. And it was just a mess. So you would have put a counselor to the president in charge and of the policy of all of this. You had a series of counselors that were being created as White House aides who would then be able to control in a way that had never been controlled the executive branch. This terrified the Congress. I've long thought that one of the reasons that the Congress was so anxious to hold the hearings it held in Watergate is it needed to block this rather dramatic policy that they knew was in the wings that Nixon was developing. And that's probably the most dramatic change. I don't think we would have been in, we would have seen some terribly abusive use of government. Nixon, that was not in his disposition. I think that he was trying to make the government work better, and in a way that really is a little bit frightening. For example, things like developed during the Reagan years, like the so-called unitary executive theory that brings all the regulatory agencies under the White House. I'm not so sure that's healthy. We hadn't gone that far in this reorganization. It was really to make the principal agencies, not all the independent regulatories, subject to the president's control and his policies.
We'll go to Victor, who is joining us from Allentown, Pennsylvania, with John Dean. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for taking my call. You spoke at Lehigh University in 2007 on the subject of worse than Watergate and broken government. I had the honor of asking you a question about authoritarianism. Several years earlier, you had been recorded as saying that this country was about 25% fascist.
No,
in response to my...
not fascist. I just said authoritarian.
Well, I understand. In response, well, I have it on tape that you did answer a question in which that word was used.
Yes, I'll explain that.
And when you answered the question, you explained that you were talking about authoritarianism. Oh, and by the way, I gave you a silver dollar with the Constitution on it, so you may remember me. But I thought your book was just excellent on that subject of authoritarianism. So could you distinguish between fascism, authoritarianism, Nazism, and militarism?
Sure.
And maybe in the context of having known Alexander Haig, who went from lieutenant colonel to chief of staff at the Nixon White House, the head of NATO, the Secretary of State. That's my question.
Okay,
thanks for the call, Victor.
Let me see if I can handle that for you. First of all, my whole study of authoritarianism is based on social science. In the aftermath of World War II, a group of social scientists tried to get together to find out if what had happened in Italy and Germany could ever happen in the United States. Could we follow a Mussolini or a Hitler? Would we tolerate things like a Holocaust in this country? And the sad answer was yes, there's some segment of the population that has an authoritarian personality. The book in the study was well and probably rightly criticized when it first came out, because it was based largely on Freudian psychology, which has its own problems. Another group of social scientists, and particularly one who landed up in Canada, a fellow by the name of Robert Altmaier, decided to look at this question again, and doing it by rather solid empirical studies. By that I mean he would question people about the nature of their personality, their dispositions, and what have you, and would over time collect one of the largest databases that we would ever assemble on this, and found excuse me, clearly there is an authoritarian personality type. They actually break down into several categories. There are authoritarian followers, there are authoritarian leaders, or they call them dominators, and then there are people who have uniquely traits of both. It's because they score so high on these tests, they call them double highs. These became, and some of the dominators became my conservatives without conscience. And when you understand this this class of person and this type of personality, you understand why this is true. They have no conscience whatsoever. And I asked Altmaier over the years, who had studied this, I said, how many people fall in this category, the overall, not just the double highs or the dominators or the followers, but just the whole alone, but the whole collective. And he said about, as best he can figure, about 25% of the United States would follow in this category. This isn't a good or bad, this isn't a pathology, this is just the nature of a certain element of the American population. And it's a very real element. I think we're seeing it today very much in the Tea Party movement, which is the next step beyond the material I had in my book. I've got to tell you that in writing that book, which I had originally planned to write with the late Senator Goldwater, but his health became bad, so we could not do it together. It was one of the most informative books I'd ever written. I've learned more from it. I've returned to it to understand things on any book more than all those I have done, because it was so eye-opening to understand. I looked at fascism to see if these were fascist. They clearly are not. This isn't even incipient fascism, but it's the stuff from which fascism obviously can arise. We have never in this country had authoritarians take charge. They're not large enough in their numbers, and even some of them who test high or would test high, as soon as they realize their personality nature, they back away from it. They're not even comfortable with it themselves because it isn't our norm for our political activity. There is a chart in one of these books, or a table, that sets forth, I think it's page 68 and 69 of the book, that gives you a catalog of these personality traits, and it's not very pleasant, but it's very real, and I think just understanding these people helps us to deal with them.
Alexander Haig, who recently passed away, and so did Jerry TeHorst, who served for about a month as Gerald Ford's press secretary. One of our viewers, Randy Reed from Illinois, saying, what did his resignation mean in terms of the protest to the Nixon pardon?
The terror host, it was, I think a lot of people were stunned when Jerry Ford did this. It was no surprise. He had hinted he was going to do it. I was one who was about to go off to be incarcerated. I never did go to prison, but I was in a witness protection program for a long time, and I was about to go off and make a safe house my regular residence, where I would be brought into the city almost every day, which I was. So I wasn't real happy about it. My wife was quite upset with it, and most of those who were involved in Watergate were really quite shocked that it wasn't even broader. But it was something I'd never asked for nor wanted. But I think that in the long run, it was the right decision. And I think while Ford obviously suffered his ability to win the presidency on his own as a result of the pardon, there's just enough people who really felt strongly about it that would have made a difference in that election had that not have been the key issue. But it's pretty ugly to contemplate any former president of the United States on trial for what happened during Nixon's presidency. There's a real question as to whether Richard Nixon could have ever received a fair trial if the well had not been so poisoned from which you draw jurors that you'd never find a juror that could give him an honest reading. He had some defenses. So a lot of this material, a lot of this activity was, in his mind, national security activity. He wasn't, his motive, in fact, Bud Krogh went to visit him after he'd been pardoned, and asked him, he said, "Mr. President, do you feel you are guilty of a crime?" And Nixon said, "No, I don't. I really don't." And that kind of attitude obviously made it very difficult to him to even understand why he needed a pardon, but his lawyers advised him to take one.
But you never met with Richard Nixon after you left the White House.
Never did. I think it would have been very difficult for Nixon. My last conversation with him was on Easter in 1973, Easter of 1973. And he said, "John, I'm calling to tell you you're still my counsel, that I still know what you've told me, and I will not forget it." Of course, it was what we call a stroking call to try to keep me from doing what I ultimately knew I had to do, which was testify about what had happened.
A Twitter question from Derek Dye, who lives in Meadville, Pennsylvania, saying, as a young person, should I be looking up to Glenn Beck or Barry Goldwater to learn what it means to be a conservative?
I don't understand Glenn Beck's conservatism at all, and it has nothing to do with the conservatism that has been in such a long tradition in this country. And if you look in Conservatives Without Conscience, I think you'd immediately understand why. I didn't even include Glenn Beck in the book.
Next is a call from Lee in New Orleans. Welcome to the program, Lee.
Hi. Wonder if you could say, Mr. Dean could say a little about why white supremacy, white racism is such an important component in American conservatism. I mean, you've mentioned Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign and his trips to the South, clearly with white supremacists in his interactions down there. So I'm wondering why this is, why the American conservative movement has allowed white supremacy to be such an important component in their development and rise in America.
Well, I think it's a rather new phenomenon. As a matter of fact, if there is anybody who was not a supremacist or a racist, it's Barry Goldwater. He's the man who integrated the Arizona National Guard long before Truman had even done so with the armed services. He's somebody who, for example, there were black and white theaters in Phoenix that he, as a member of the city council, eliminated. He's somebody who voted against the '64 Civil Rights Bill, much to his later chagrin, on the advice of two lawyers who he was very impressed with. He said there was I asked him this question one day. I said, why in the world? Because I happened to have been in the gallery for that vote. I was in law school at the time, went up to see the vote. It was such a historic vote, and I was very curious as to how he was going to vote on it. I had another friend in law school whose father was in the Senate and got us some nice prime seats in the galleries and waited for that historic vote. And when Goldwater, years later, asked him, why did you vote against it? He said, well, he had the advice of this young lawyer from Phoenix who I greatly respected by the name of Bill Rehnquist, and another one from a professor from Yale who sent me a dynamite memo by the name of Bork. He said, do you know Robert Bork? I said, I sure do. And so on those two constitutional analysis of the '64 bill, he believed sincerely that it was an unconstitutional action, and it indeed would be thrown out by the courts as such, and that was the basis of his vote.
Let me go back to something that you wrote about in your book on Warren Harding. You both grew up in the same town, Marion, Ohio.
Yes.
And you write about a speech that Warren Harding gave October 26, 1921, Birmingham, Alabama.
In Woodrow Wilson National Park.
And in the speech, he said, I would say to a black man, if he is fit to vote, he should be able to vote. I would say to a white man voting when he is unfit, he should be prohibited from voting. And he said, quote, whether you like it or not, unless our democracy is a lie, you must stand for equality. This is 1921.
I had such fun doing the Harding book because the Harding has been so maligned as a president. He is typically considered one of our worst presidents. And I had grown up in Marion, Ohio, his town, and my next door neighbor was the editor who would follow Warren Harding some years later as the editor of the Marion Star, which was Harding's creation and had been the first editor of the paper. He introduced me and gave me my first Harding book, with Harding becoming, if you will, my first president. My library has everything that's ever been written about Harding, good, bad, and indifferent. And I realized a long time ago particularly picking up this information as a kid, that Harding hadn't been given a very fair shake as a president. So when Arthur Schlesinger Jr. started the series of which I wrote one of the books on all 42, then 42 past presidents, I called Arthur, had known him for years. Arthur had written some rather ugly things about Warren Harding himself. And I said, Arthur, I bet you don't know what to do with Harding. He said, John, I don't have a clue what to do with Harding. And he said, are you really interested? I said, I am very interested. When I turned in my manuscript, Arthur called and he said, you have given me an entirely different perspective on Warren Harding. He said, I didn't realize some of the information you had. You're one of the few people I know who've ever actually looked at the papers that did survive his presidency. I think it's a mistake that we have done with Harding. He asked me to cut just a very few. I was a little hard on some of his friends who were historians, on some of the false material they'd put out on Harding. It was I turned Arthur 180 degrees, which was just a wonderful undertaking because he had these fixed views of Harding. The speech you're referring to was a really brave act at the time Harding did it. He went into the South. The audience was segregated. There was a wire fence between the whites and the blacks. And Harding spent most of that speech looking right at the whites and telling them that you just can't go forward in a democracy and call it a democracy and treat people on the other side of that fence the way you're doing so. It was a speech that was it was hated by the South, but he still thought that there were inroads even then for the Republicans in the South, and the blacks were by and large thrilled with it. He had not done as much as they wanted, but he did a lot as president. Woodrow Wilson, his predecessor, had been sadly a serious racist. Had removed blacks from positions that they'd long been in the District of Columbia and the federal government. And then as soon as he got them out of those positions, put a civil service in so they couldn't get back in. Harding did what he could about hiring more blacks and getting them in, but was a true progressive on this. In fact, so much of Harding's material, while he is still in many regards a classic conservative president, is also a highly progressive president, particularly on social issues.
One other story from the book, you describe December of 1920. The transition is in place. Florence Harding meets with Edith Wilson, describes her as haughty and condescending. And in the tour of the White House conducted not by the First Lady.
Haughty was a rather nice description of her, I think.
But in the tour of the White House, not conducted by Mrs. Wilson, but by the housekeeper, Florence Harding views this White House as the home of a very sick man. Can you elaborate?
Yes, Wilson, of course, had a stroke many, many months earlier when he had come back from Europe and negotiating the League of Nations, had gone out on a tour to try to sell it to the American people. While on tour, had a very severe stroke, had come back, pretended he was all right when he was bedfast for all practical purposes. They had pulled the shades and the place had become a rather grim semi-hospital for a very ill, incapacitated president who was surviving unbeknownst to what he was capable of, and was capable of actually very little. Harding made an interesting call during the campaign when his aides tried to get him to attack Wilson and his health. And he said, there's no way I will win the presidency over this sick man's problem. I just refused to he attacked the Wilson policies, not Harding, or not Wilson himself and his condition. So you're right, when Florence came in and looked around, and everything from the odors to the atmosphere, just decided she was going to have the place painted and open the windows and invite people back into the White House where they hadn't had a function in the last time anyone could remember, and did so, and it changed the whole atmosphere of the White House with people coming and going.
Our next call from Florida, David is on the phone. Welcome to In Depth with John Dean.
Thank you very much, and Steve, as always, thank you and your whole staff for C-SPAN. You do a great service for America. And I want to pick up on what Mr. Dean said before I ask my question about Woodrow Wilson. If it were not for Glenn Beck, many Americans who did not know before would not know what a miserable man Woodrow Wilson was, how he brought segregation into the federal government, both in Washington, D.C., specifically, and throughout the civil service and the armed forces. He was a horrible man. Now, what I originally called to ask and to find a comment on is the fact that Gordon Liddy seems to be a very credible man these days on the buying of gold. Isn't it amazing that he has so many followers and the company that's selling the gold, that's using him to sell the gold, finds him very credible in doing that? I'd love to hear your comment on it. Thank you.
David, thanks for the call. Keep watching C-SPAN 2's Book TV. John Dean.
I'm not buying any gold from Gordon.
Let me ask you about some of the other people that you write about in the end of the story, Blind Ambition. We already talked about Richard Nixon. You never met with him. You did run into Bob Haldeman in Westwood, California.
And John Ehrlichman.
Well, let's talk about Bob Haldeman first.
I ran into Bob in a very odd situation. I was coming down a bank of elevators. He worked for a fellow by the name of Murdoch in California, who was a very successful developer, and this happened to be Murdoch's building. And I had gone to see somebody up on one of the top floors who had an office there. And after the meeting came down, and in the basement in the parking area, ran into who other than Bob Haldeman. And it was just one of those, he and I were the only people down there. We had a lovely exchange. He gave me his business card. I gave him mine. He said, let's get together for lunch. I said, Bob, I'd really like to do that. I think there are a lot of notes at this late stage that we could compare and try to help to put together the pieces of what in the hell happened. And he said, I'd like that. Unfortunately, Bob, I didn't follow up fast enough. He didn't follow up fast enough. Next thing I learned is he had stomach cancer and was shortly gone.
And he did not undergo medical treatment. Why?
He did not. A number of his aides who were talking to him and talking to me and said that it was something that actually was treatable, but because of his Christian Science beliefs, that he said this was one thing he was going to do the way he felt that his religion called for him to do. And if the Lord healed him, you know, he would be healed. If not, his time was up. And that was what happened.
In an interview in 1981, John Ehrlichman called Richard Nixon a pathetic figure in American history. Would you agree with that assessment?
I don't know if I'd call him a pathetic figure. I can understand where Ehrlichman was coming from. My publisher has convinced me for my next book I should return to Nixon. It was something I have done very reluctantly. I've never actually written about Richard Nixon per se. He's passed through on other things, but I've really never looked at Nixon, and so I'm doing that right now. One of the things I found recently in the archives, not on this trip, on a prior trip, the Nixon papers are on their way to California. They're going to actually be a little bit more convenient for me. But I found that in those final days, both Haldeman and Ehrlichman submitted rather full applications for pardons. They made their best case in the presentations, and it would be clear after reading Ehrlichman in particular, his submission, why he would be extremely bitter when Nixon did not grant him a pardon, because everything everyone had done had been basically for Nixon, and the fact that he would not see fit for one of two of the finest public servants he'd ever known, as he announced when they departed, to not issue a pardon, as George Bush would when Bush won, when Cap Weinberger and some others were involved in things that had occurred during his presidency, had not taken care of it. I'm sure that he was bitter for the rest of his life. He became a very bitter man. I think it took years off of his longevity. He got involved in a lot of this Watergate revisionism, wanting to believe it, and I saw a man go downhill pretty quickly.
For 3 hours during the first Sunday of every month, we go in-depth with authors. This month, John Dean. He has written 10 books and now working on your 11th.
11.
And John is joining us from Las Vegas. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Dean, I wanted to know if you thought that what happened in the 1960 election in Illinois and West Virginia had a major impact on President Nixon's attitudes towards the powers that be, the media, and what have you. And did you have any conversations regarding, I believe his top lawyers at the time wanted him to challenge the electoral count in Illinois, which would have given him the presidency. But from what I've known, and I had an indirect conversation, a second-party conversation with the president back around 1966. His reasoning for not challenging that election, I believe, was it would have torn the country apart in a time in the 60s when we had a very serious problem with nuclear confrontation with the Russians. And if you would please give me your thoughts or any conversations, and maybe that made him a little bitter to the press and what have you because of the stolen election.
Thank you, John.
That's yes, John, that's a good summary of the situation. And Nixon's position was indeed that it would be too divisive if he did so. What was never really fully reported is, yes, there were problems in the Chicago area. What never really got flushed out, because he did send a number of emissaries out to check out the situation to see what would happen if he did contest it, and the downstate Illinois elections would have totally obliterated any changes if there was hanky-panky in Chicago. So he realized in the long run he really would not have been able to prevail with Illinois. But rather than make an issue out of that and all that polling and searching he'd done in downstate, he just let it pass and took the high road, and I think to his benefit for doing so.
Let's go to Tim, who's joining us from Hancock, Michigan. Good morning. Tim, you with us?
Hello.
Go ahead,
yes,
please.
I am. Thank you. Oh, I've got a question to John about the car that he used to drive. It was a Porsche, and I was just curious
a 911.
What he did with it. If he still had it or if he sold it.
It was a Porsche 911, a little maroon one. Great shape. I love the car. In fact, every time I drive on the Dulles Road, I think about that car. And coming in from the airport just a few days ago, I thought about it, because when I used to drive the Dulles Road, when I had that car 30-some years ago, there were no police on it, and it was a good time to get the carbon out of the cylinders of the car. I sold it back to the dealer, so I never did find out what happened to it when I left and went to California.
Scott Elliott of Allentown, Pennsylvania, what was your most memorable moment during your tenure in the Nixon presidency?
Well, there were certainly more good days than bad days. Watergate was a surprisingly small part of it. The most memorable days it would be hard to say days, because it was such a unique position. The counsel's office was high enough that you could see over everything virtually that happened in the White House as well as the government itself. So it was a wonderful perch from which to understand government. The overall job experience was very rewarding. I've often thought that, you know, in looking, particularly going back and looking at our papers, my files are one of the larger of the Nixon White House collections, and I'm not ashamed of anything we did in 99% of our work. They're good opinions. They were well handled. The processing was good lawyering. We blew Watergate totally, but that was me. I didn't even tell my staff about what was happening, because it never occurred to me when I went over there that one needed to be a a criminal lawyer. I realize in that particular administration it was essential that the White House counsel be a very sophisticated criminal lawyer. Had that been the case, my antenna might have been up and I might have been able to help the president much better by having that reaction faster than I did.
In one of the books you say, that, and I'm paraphrasing, but there was no single meeting to plan the cover-up.
Never. Never. The cover-up was very much catch as catch can. It was reaction to what was happening as it happened. A lot of confusion initially as to what had occurred, who, why were all these men arrested in the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, who was James McCord at the re-election committee, who were these Cuban Americans. We were really struggling to put together the pieces initially and try to understand it. But as I say, that I don't, to best of my knowledge, I'd never even heard of the crime of obstruction of justice at that point. It wasn't until we're well on the other side of the law that I pulled the code book down and started looking there and say, well, what are we doing here, and is this a problem? And indeed it was. And when I first raised it, for example, with John Ehrlichman, another lawyer, I said, John, this looks pretty clearly to me like obstruction of justice we've gotten ourselves involved in. We better have second thoughts. And he had one of those lines that John typically had, you don't forget easily. And he said, is there something putrid in your water out there in Old Town where you live? And I said, no. He said, well, I just think you're all wrong on this. He wasn't willing to look at the code. He didn't want any part of it. So anyway, it was, I don't think, in fact, another interesting thing comes up on the Nixon tapes. After I go in and start telling Nixon about the seriousness of the problems, he will later have conversations with Haldeman saying, I just don't think Dean is right that this is obstruction of justice. I don't think there's anything wrong with paying these guys off. And they didn't want to accept that these, because they did not feel, and first of all, there was no bad motive in this. In fact, I recently ran into a memo in the prosecutor's office on good intentions in committing criminal offenses. So they were worried about that as a defense by some of the people involved, that they would say that we had no real criminal intent to do something that broke the law. To the contrary, we didn't even know we were breaking the law. Because I think that was very widespread in the Nixon White House. One of the things was, there were mistakes made because there are so many federal crimes. Now, these would be obstruction of justice and defrauding the government by misusing agencies of government would all become, after Watergate, well understood. You don't do that. Before then, these thoughts just didn't jump into our mind.
So let me go back to the tapes and something.
Not that it makes them innocent, it just makes them more understandable how we did them.
Well, you write about the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. There are two questions I have for you. First of all, that famous photograph of Rosemary Woods kind of stretching with the typewriter and the dicta belt. How did that come about? And then I want to ask you what was in that conversation and why it's missing.
Well, the photograph, as I recall, was done after the taping system became aware and subpoenas were served and what have you. Then the president agreed he had to turn over some of the tapes, and these gaps started appearing. First of all, they thought it was a 5-minute gap, then it's an 18-and-a-half-minute gap. Other tapes are missing, and they have a massive hearing over in Judge Sirica's courtroom. And at one point, I think they went back to Rose's office and to have her show so the jury or the judge could see, with just a judge then, what had happened and how she could reach the machine and have her foot on the pedal, or reach the telephone and have her foot on the pedal at the same time. And the long and short of it was, it wasn't possible. It wasn't physically possible. So that's shown in that picture how difficult it was. But when she was actually on the stand, it showed that she couldn't do it. There has never been much of a mystery in my mind about how that happened. There were only 3 people who had that conversation on June 20th. One was
1972.
72. One was Steve Bull, who queued it up for the president when he wanted to listen to it. Another was Rosemary Woods when she was trying to transcribe it. The third was Richard Nixon, who was not very good with machinery. I remember him having machinery so basic as opening your drawer, or my favorite was when he would try to take the medicine tops off the bottles where you had to push them down and turn them. He just could not get those off. He'd have them in his mouth, and you'd want to say, Mr. President, can I help you? So I can imagine him hearing that tape and saying, oh my God, or even trying to re-listen to it and say, let me listen to that again, and getting the wrong buttons, because the experts who Judge Sirica hired to look at it said it took 7 to 9 different times to erase. Well, you don't even need 7 to 9 different times. So I can see Nixon trying to recapture it and then saying, well, let me get it again, and not understanding how it worked at all and doing this. And since he's the only one who knows he did it, he's never admitted to anybody, so no one has ever known, you know, what it is.
Let's come back to that, but Butch is joining us from Jackson, Wyoming. Welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure talking to you, Mr. Dean. I see you on MSNBC a lot. I'd just like to know a few questions. I could sit down and talk to you for hours. Are you still a conservative philosophy, of the conservative philosophy? I'd like to know what you thought of the movie with David Frost and Nixon interview. I'd also like to know about the new movie W that's out, and your opinion about, I think it was Scowcroft that said that when he knew Cheney, that Cheney today is not the Cheney that he knew. And do you have any idea what he was talking about? Can you?
Thank you, Butch.
Okay, let me take the first. On many issues, I still consider myself a Goldwater conservative. I am about as non-political for somebody who writes about politics as you can imagine, and I say that in a partisan sense. I vote both sides. I don't believe that anybody has all the answers, and I try to study a problem and vote for who I think might be the best candidate for the best circumstance, and try not to be driven by any ideology. I'm registered in California as an independent for all practical purposes. They have a clause where you don't have to declare either party, so I don't. So those are my politics. Your next question about
the Frost-Nixon movie.
The Frost-Nixon movie. I have not seen that yet. I actually have it on my iPhone, and I was thinking about watching it on the way back, but I watched Inglourious Bastards instead, and so I haven't seen it yet, but I will soon. And I understand it's well done. I still certainly remember the original, but I think that I was delighted to see it because Ron Howard does such a good job with everything he does that it brought those issues to mind to another generation. And trust me, as somebody, I've been over at USC's Annenberg School as a visiting scholar for about 9 years now. And kids today, they know nothing about Watergate. I did a little seminar here in Washington for Harvard law students who have a Washington semester. They know nothing about Watergate today. So I try to get out and about a little bit and talk about it.
The movie W?
The movie W. I've not seen the movie W. I'm not even. Is that been released? I don't know that.
It came out a few years ago.
Missed it totally. I missed W.
And Brent Scowcroft's description of Dick Cheney.
Scowcroft, I am aware of that description, and I think there is something to that. I've talked to a number of people who have known Cheney over the years. I heard David Gergen recently on CNN talking about Al Haig after he passed, and Haig had a quadruple bypass and how he had changed after that. I looked at that when I was writing Worse Than Watergate. I talked about Cheney's health and the fact that he wouldn't release his health records. And I did a lot of digging then, and I actually talked to a doctor very recently who was doing some more research on this subject as to whether a quadruple bypass does change a personality. Because I think there were two different Cheneys, and You know, it's only anecdotal apparently at this point as to whether personalities change in these circumstances, but from those who knew one Cheney, I didn't know Dick Cheney at the Nixon White House in his earlier iteration. I knew people who worked with him when he was White House Chief of Staff. They were not overly impressed with him then. And I must say that I find him a rather troubling character. I find him a very typical authoritarian conservative. I'm very anxious for his book to come out to see what he says to try to justify this. Probably won't try to justify it, just claim it's okay. But I'm glad that it's not likely he's going to ever be elected president.
Speaking of books, your favorite books, among the list, Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs and My Life So Far by Jane Fonda.
I couldn't resist that. I think I've known Jane for a number of years, and when I read her book, I talked to her when she was working on her book. And the book is so honest. I wish more people could write autobiographies with that kind of candor. And so for that reason, I had a number of my male friends read that book. I said, I think we all need to better understand a woman's point of view on so many issues, and Jane is very outspoken on them. So when I was assembling that list, I said I should put Jane's book because I've recommended it to so many people.
Ann is joining us from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Welcome to In Depth on Book TV. So many people. Ann is joining us from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Welcome to In Depth on Book TV.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. I, too, watched, you know, I was just, when the Watergate hearings were on, I was just glued to the screen, and I was just fascinated by the whole thing. The person's name eludes me at the time. He was known as Deep Throat, and of course he's been exposed.
Mark Felt.
Well, thank you. Nixon was aware that he was feeding information continuously to Woodward and Bernstein. Why didn't he fire him?
Well, he really wasn't aware he was feeding it to Woodward and Bernstein. What happened is, and this comes up on one of the tapes in October of 1972, I've been over at the Department of Justice. I've learned from Henry Peterson that Felt is leaking. Henry Peterson has learned it from one of the lawyers from the Washington Post. And he pulls me aside and says, you know, Felt is a serious leak problem, and we're worried that it could affect the investigation. I went back and reported that to Haldeman, who in turn reported it to Nixon. That's where you see it on the tape. The tape is one of those that Stanley Cutler transcribed in his book, Abuse of Power. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult conversation to understand. I listened to it based on a tip from some people at the archives, and I heard a lot of different things on the tape. One of the most interesting things that is said towards the end of the conversation, and Stanley had to use a lot of ellipses in the thing because he didn't have it and just wanted to shorten it. And so at one point you have this conversation where Nixon makes the rhetorical statement. He said to Haldeman, he said, you know what I'd do with Felt, Bob? And then there's an ellipses and it just kind of tapers off and he says, son of a bitch. Well, I listened to the conversation. I heard something very different. He says, you know what I would do with Mark Felt, Bob? Ambassadorship. Big difference. That's what he did with Helms at the CIA. He gave him an ambassadorship. So yes, they knew he was a leak, but at this point there is no deep throat. The reason I had always kept him off the list of my candidates is because by the time Bob Woodward is getting his latest and last tip from Deep Throat is the first week of November of 1973. Mark Felt is out of the FBI in May of '73. It may be that he just had somebody who gave him a tip that was very late in the game, and the only thing he gave him is something he picked off the White House grapevine. But that's the reason I always had felt never really made my list. And the other big thing, I think, is there are, for somebody in his position who is, for all practical purposes, the #1 man on the Watergate investigation in the FBI, there's a massive amount of bad information. I mean, dead wrong information. At one point, I was flying to Australia, and I had a lot of time. It's a long flight even from Los Angeles, about 17 hours. So I took the Woodward Bernstein book along, and I had my laptop, and I pulled out everything that Felt had given to Woodward and Bernstein, to principally Bob. And I found about half of it's dead wrong. And I posted it on one of my articles at FindLaw. So if you Google Deep Throat, FindLaw, Dean, you can find, and they're all done in red, you can find out how much bad information he got.
In fact, you only mentioned Mark Felt 3 times in this book.
Right.
But Pat Buchanan's name comes up. Did you think it was him?
Well, the only reason I thought it was Pat Buchanan is that was sort of a romantic interest. I think that Pat would have been a wonderful Deep Throat. I wanted it to have somebody have noble motives, and Pat would have had noble motives.
Louise is joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with John Dean. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Mr. Dean, I have 2 comments and a question. First of all, you're right. It is difficult to define the conservative movement, but Karl Rove gave us a clue. I once read a quote from Mr. Rove where he said that once you think you have us figured out, we change like chameleons and go in a different direction. My second comment is, recently a right-leaning Supreme Court ruled that large corporations could contribute to campaign advertising with no limitations. And it's a known fact that during the 2008 campaign, most of Obama's donations came from lower to middle class people like myself. We gave more than usual and in larger numbers. So my question is, wasn't the Supreme Court ruling a way to put more corporate money into the 2002 Republican campaign and outdo donations made by average income Americans?
Yes, you're talking about a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. A very troubling decision. A very troubling decision for me for a lot of reasons. First of all, it wasn't a case they had to decide. It's one that there was obviously a majority of the justices realized they had 5 votes, so they reached out with a case they had before them, and they added that to the case. This is what I would call judicial activism in spades. When conservatives do it, they don't seem to complain about it. But yes, they clearly wanted to resolve this issue, and making a corporation a person under the 14th Amendment is always dubious. To make them a person that can make campaign contributions, given the very unique difference between a corporate person and a human person, where a corporate person is given indefinite life. They're often given tax breaks, letting them reach into the general treasury when the shareholders may not want this money given. Very troubling, very troubling. We don't know yet how this is going to play out. I think we've got to hope for the best, but the potential for the worst is certainly there, and we'll get what I'm told by lawyers who are advising their clients now is they're telling their corporate clients to keep a low profile. Say, we've won, let's just play quiet for a while, go through our trade associations, the Chamber of Commerce, what have you, and don't start getting the, where we want to all have our own senators we own. That would be a disaster. So I think they're being cautious initially, but it's a very, very troubling precedent.
You can join the conversation online at twitter.com/booktv or send us an email question at booktv@cspan.org. David is joining us from Oceanside, California. Go ahead, please.
Good morning here in Oceanside. God bless C-SPAN, and thank you, Mr. Dean. I've enjoyed several of your appearances on C-SPAN. I was going to ask about Nixon's support from Goldwater in the White House and withdrawal of that support. You used the term Watergate revisionism. I'd love to hear your top 3 Watergate revisionist strings at some point. But I want to change direction slightly since you were talking about Mark Felt. Obviously, the idea that Mark felt that deep throat was this wonderful, voice for sanity pushing upward. It seems more like he was your authoritarian personality, which seems to be endemic in the FBI.
Well, I think you're right on Felt could well fall in the authoritarian personality type. Very self-righteous in doing what he's doing it for his own betterment, not for the good of the nation in any stretch of the imagination. Why he's misleading Woodward so much, I'm not quite sure. He's telling him things like, well, you got to be careful, you're all out there going to be wiretapped. Well, that's just baloney. That was none of that business going on. He's got so many of the events mischaracterized that there's trouble. I can understand why Bob Woodward has gone on. He doesn't want to bother to go back and correct that history. He's often troubled by the fact that I'm unable to shake loose of it. So I can't. For some reason, it follows me wherever I go. So I might as well stay informed on it. I think that's a fair description of authoritarian type personality.
We'll talk more about the so-called revisionist history on Watergate. Another hour and a half with our guest, John Dean, here on Book TV's In Depth. More of your phone calls, and also, as I said, join the conversation online at twitter.com. Back in a moment.
What's a normal workday like for you?
Well, most mornings after I digest my 2 or 3 newspapers, increasingly I'm taking those online. In fact, recently stopped my print editions from coming after 30 years of that. I exercise, I'm fortunate I have a gym in the house, a Stairmaster or a recumbent bike or a treadmill, where I read. I continue to read because I think that's a great place to get the juices going. Then I'll come up here typically about 10 o'clock and start in the day. Depends on what phase of the book I'm in. Right now the office is pretty clean because I haven't plowed through all the documents I'm working on the book I'm working on right now. But I tend to stack things up on the floor in very precise stacks where I know where everything is and get it all spread out. My wife accuses me of being a hamster. I just find that very convenient. So 1, I don't forget things when I'm working on them, and 2, they're very accessible. But I'm right now in a reading phase. This is my book cart right here we're sitting by, and so I'm diving through that, making notes, getting a general overview of what I'm working on, and not really into the deep specifics at this point. When I'm actually in the writing process, I have papers everywhere. I spend a lot of time doing original research, looking for primary documents. I've gathered right now about 15,000 pages of documents for the book I'm working on. I'm on my trip back east. We'll be gathering about another 5,000 pages, I suspect. I'll then sort all that, go through it, what have you, and I recurrently go through and double check to make sure I'm not missing things. When I'm writing, I'm there at the keyboard, but because it is such a passive activity, I keep my Stairmaster or a little stepper here, and we'll jump up, say, in fact, I have a clock on alarm on one of my computers. I have a facility to concentrate, and I can literally lose the world around me and find myself 2-3 hours without even moving. In fact, I got a pretty good case of carpal tunnel in my right wrist from that very problem of just working, not realizing the time I was spending being in a bad posture, having the wrist up above. So I actually now use my mouse with my left hand. We are very adaptable. I switched over, now I'm as fast with my left hand as I am while I'm right-handed. But I break up the pace of sitting at the endless hours at the computer by jumping up onto my stepper, just for exercise, circulation, read there, make notes. There's a wonderful piece of software that's been out 4 or 5 months now called Dragon Dictation for the iPhone, and it converts dictation to text. So I'll have my book right there that I want to make notes on. I'll dictate some note from the book, then I just email it over to my computer. Very handy, very handy. So I have no downtime, if you will. But for the digital age we live in, I couldn't be producing a book a year. It used to take a lot longer to go to the library, to handwrite everything out, to manually type it. I also use a voice recognition software that eases up the wrist. If I have, say, a number of passages I need to pull out of a book, I'll just dictate them into my right into my machine. So I'm very digital in my work, and I'm also, as I'm preparing my next book, with the coming of the iPad, I'm really thinking about multimedia. I'm thinking this is unique. There's a lot of public domain information connected with this. I won't have to screw around with rights to give a value added to this work I'm doing. And not many people, for example, have heard the Nixon tapes, and while the office tapes are terrible, some of the conversations are good, and some of those will work into my thing. There's other multimedia things I can use, so I'm thinking more than just the straight linear narrative this time, as I'm working on this book, of what you can do with an iPad, which is kind of fun.
John Dean, from Blind Ambition and Lost Honor to Pure Goldwater and the Rehnquist Choice. Thanks for being with us here on Book TV's In Depth.
Pleasure.
As we continue our conversation, the personal side of Richard Nixon, what was he like to interact with?
You know, for me, he's certainly easy to work with. He was always pleasant. He had met my wife once flying on Air Force One, and he'd always say, "How's your pretty little wife?" and things like that. I discovered, actually, when doing the Rehnquist Choice, I listened to a lot of tapes with a lot of different people, and he's sort of a chameleon. He would have a different personality with different aides. I'd never realized it until I'd heard him, you know, doing one-on-one with others. It seems that, say, for example, Haldeman and Colson would bring the worst out on him. With Mitchell, he was talking for a long time with more of a peer, seeking his advice. What do you think, John? You know, so on and so forth. with people like Ray Price and with me. You don't hear him swear. You don't hear him use his locker room occasionally, but not like he did with others. So he's different with different people on the staff. You know, I laughed out loud. In fact, I laughed out loud rereading the book. Nixon's take on women, for example. Here his daughters were pushing him, along with his wife, to put a woman on the Supreme Court. He had 2 vacancies to fill. So they're really leaning on him. And we actually did very seriously consider a woman, Mildred Lilly, who probably, if she'd not been shot down by an all-male panel of 12 members of the ABA, she would have been on the court. And I later looked at her credentials versus Sandra Day, equally as good, if not in some regards experience-wise better. But anyway, when listening to these tapes, he would say things like to Mitchell, he'd say, you know, John, he said, I don't have any women in my cabinet. Thank God I don't have any women in my cabinet, you know, but my cabinet's so lousy anyway, maybe it won't make any difference. And he'd say, you know, I don't believe women should even be educated. They should Here he's got 2 lovely daughters, and he's a very complex man, clearly.
Could you ever assess the relationship between Pat and Dick Nixon?
I would be reluctant to do so. My few dealings, for example, I had some estate matters that had to be dealt with when he was doing his estate planning. I was the intermediary to his outside lawyers, and he had me get the information from his wife rather than he got it from his wife. He would address her by send her memos, but I send my wife emails now, and every time I do it, I think, am I being Richard Nixon and sending Mo an email? And I try to do that very sparingly.
Your name came up today in the New York Times Sunday magazine, an interview with Charles Colson, and he said he had a target with your picture on it that he'd throw darts at.
Well, Chuck and I have an on and off again relationship. We got on. He was out at Holabird when I was there. I was on the. He was still working with Nixon very, very late. You know, when I've broken rank and he's trying to break me, using all of his hatchet tactics. Chuck was, I think, disappointed that I wouldn't join him in the Christian right, and he really did a little proselytizing there for a while to try to get me to join with him. And I think he's been disappointed. And on issues today, you know, my writing books like Conservatives Without Conscience and writing about the religious right, those are Chuck's people. Those are his politics today. He's transferred one set of conservative politics for a new set of conservative politics, and they happen to be very different from mine.
As always, we welcome your phone calls. 202 is the area code for those of you living in the Eastern or Central time zones. The number is 202-737-0001. And for those of you in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, in our conversation with John Dean, 202-737-0002. Wayne is joining us from Cove Springs, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Dean, what was the verdict or outcome of the lawsuit he filed against G. Gordon Liddy?
What happened with, I filed a defamation lawsuit, my wife and I, against a group of revisionists who had created a news story of Watergate claiming, I actually learned about the lawsuit, or learned about the whole issue when Mike Wallace called me early one Monday morning, asking me if I knew I was in the middle of a new book coming out that explained that I had actually, unbeknownst to the FBI, unbeknownst to the Watergate prosecutor, unbeknownst to the Senate Watergate Committee, unbeknownst to the House Impeachment Committee, I'd ordered the Watergate break-in. I said, no, Mike, that's news to me. How did I do that and no one learn it? He said, well, that's why we're calling to ask some questions before we go forward with this show. And he said, you should understand what they're claiming is that you learned that there was a call girl ring in the Democratic National Committee through your wife, who was associated with the madam of the call girl ring. And I said, well, that is some baloney. I can assure you that that's not true. He said, will you go on camera? I said, of course I will. I said, would you send me the book to explain how I know, how they reached all these conclusions? He said, I can't. It's a St. Martin's Press book. We've done an agreement that we won't release the book, and we're under a confidentiality agreement, so I can't. He said, I will tell you that Time magazine is going to do a release on it. We're going to do our show on Sunday night, of course. They're releasing Monday. This was about 2 weeks before the show. He said, you might get something from Time. After I agreed to do the show, Mike got off the line. I then called Time magazine. I knew the principal Watergate reporter from Time, a fellow by the name of Hayes Gorey. And I said, Hayes, what is this story? And Hayes knew nothing about it. He said, let me call New York and check. He called back and said, sure enough, we're doing an excerpt on this thing. He said, I don't know how they could buy this without running it by the people who know it most, but apparently they signed a confidentiality agreement in New York. They won't send it to me, and they won't send it to Carl Bernstein, who, of course, is Bob Woodward's partner, knew as much about Watergate as anybody. And he said, this has raised questions for me. Hayes said, I called all the people I knew, and I knew many because I covered the Democratic National Committee, to see if there could have been a call girl ring over there. And he said, I talked to a number of guys, and they said, one said, I was a bachelor. I would have been the #1 customer of this place if it existed. So Hayes says, we have some doubts, and I'm not quite sure how this is going to happen. Make a long story short on that, I called both, I got back to 60 Minutes, and I got back to Time. They both dropped the story, gave me new respect for their journalism. The publisher did publish. I put him on notice, and I learned very quickly, well, his comment was, he said, well, you'll have plenty of time to read this in the bookstores. So they're not going to back down at all. I said, well, you're going to have a lawsuit, and they did. And so we named the publishers, the authors, and we quickly learned that the silent collaborator in the book was G. Gordon Liddy. So we named him as well. The lawsuit went on for 9 years. We learned they spent $15 million fighting us. I was in a fortunate position. I'd literally shut down my business and go at this full time. And I had two goals. One was to win the lawsuit. Two was to get enough information to show that for historical purposes, that this was just pure fraud. And they had offered to settle very early. They wanted a license to continue to defame the Deans, and they didn't get that. But they did get 9 years of litigation. It would settle. I wish I could tell you of the settlement. Unfortunately, it was a confidential settlement. We're allowed to say we were satisfied, and we were satisfied.
Let me go back to something we talked about in our first hour, the 18.5-minute gap in the meeting that took place in June 1972. This is an email from one of the viewers who said, during that meeting, was there a description of the attendees of the contents in E. Howard Hunt's safe that Fred Fielding, your deputy, had retrieved the night before? Can you elaborate
was
on
there
that?
what in the...
During the meeting on June 20th, 1972, did you describe for the attendees the contents of what was in Hunt's safe?
I never saw the contents at that point, and certainly not beforehand. What happened is, in fact, I just learned this yesterday in looking at a document, that the first person to find out whether Hunt had an office and a safe was Walter Minnick, who is now in Congress. He worked for Ehrlichman at the time. He actually shared space in room 16 where the plumbers operated, but was told he wasn't supposed to talk to them about what they were doing. How much he learned by osmosis, I don't know. But anyway, Ehrlichman called him that Saturday or Sunday after the break-in and said, I've been told that Hunt was involved. Somehow his name came up in a notebook. Have you seen Hunt lately? Have you talked to him? He said, yes, as a matter of fact, I've talked to him recently about international narcotics. He said, well, will you find out if he's got an office? And Minnick said, yes, I will. He and Curli went up, the staff secretary went up and found out he did an office. The safe was locked. and they reported this back to Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman, in turn, is the one who instructed Curley to have the safe opened. It was because I was not around. I had gone to another meeting. I had asked either asked or Fred had just acted to go get the contents when they opened the safe, and then they were brought to me in boxes, and we gave some of them to the FBI. We gave some of them back to the State Department. We gave some of them directly to Pat Gray, and some of them were destroyed.
Did you always intend to be a writer, or did you just evolve into this?
You know, it's interesting. I was an English lit, American literature and English literature undergraduate. I did a lot of creative writing as an undergraduate.
At Colgate?
Colgate and the College of Worcester. An aunt reminded me, I wrote my first book at 8 years of age. So there must have been some instincts, and the short answer is yes. And when I got in business, I said, you know, what I'd really like to do, I did Blind Ambition, was first book, struggled how to do it right and what have you, did Lost Honor from then on all on my own, don't use research assistants, but enjoyed it tremendously to doing those first two books, then went into business, and I always said to myself, when I retire, and I retired fairly early at 60, I'm going to spend those retirement years cranking out books, and I've been doing one a year ever since.
Norman is joining us from Lodi, California. Welcome to the program.
Yes, in 1949, Congressman Richard Nixon sent a letter to his constituents to explain his vote on the Hill-Burton bill. I sent my letter back with a tally down both sides of the letter, showing 18 lines of copy on one side and 18 personal pronouns on the other side. It permanently colored my perception of the man. And incidentally, I voted for George McGovern solely because I felt the Watergate break-in had been done because of Nixon's compulsive desire to win by a landslide. Thank you.
Well, you know, it's interesting. McGovern, who I've come to know over the years, met him first when I was doing a profile for the Rolling Stone in '76 on the Republican convention. Went in to see him, and sitting there, and he was wearing a blue suit and sitting in his chair, and I said, you know, this man in many regards is so much more presidential than the president I worked for. In the recent years, he and I have shared a stage. He was out in California recently, and I had an event, invited him to join me. He had an event, invited me to join him, and we have an awful lot of fun up there. We have no pre-planned program, and we seem to interact well. And I think he's
87?
87, yes. And may we all be half as sharp as he is at 87. And so, as I say, we've had a pleasant friendship.
In his book, Courage and Consequence, Karl Rove, who was working at the time for then RNC chair George Herbert Walker Bush in 1973, asked one of the most fundamental questions that is asked about Watergate. He said, quote, I found it increasingly difficult to defend Nixon. What good could have come from burglarizing the DNC? Nixon had been way ahead. The Democratic Party was in disarray. Their candidate was on his way to an enormous defeat. So why?
You know, the first time I heard the name Karl Rove was when I was asked by the Watergate special prosecutor. He was on their radar. He has a small file. And it had to do with his giving classes to young Republicans. Nothing really developed of it. But I think his perception is right. Karl's always been very politically perceptive. What they don't understand is that Nixon wasn't calling the shots. These things, as I finally got together in the appendix I wrote for Blind Ambition, the new edition, the afterword, I was able to understand how the flow happened, how this happened. It started actually a couple of years beforehand, where they wanted to get good intelligence about what the Democrats were doing. And the way they did it is he wanted dirt on the Democrats and was constantly pushing them to get that dirt. And the way he pushed, was very few places they could get it. And then you would add into it, the catalyst really is the ITT scandal that arose in the spring of '72. This is when Nixon was accused of having his administration settle an antitrust case for hefty campaign contribution, a bribery. It was untrue. There was a whole special investigation by the Watergate prosecutor on that. Didn't pan out. It didn't happen. But what happened, what's forgotten, and I put this together, the sequence, the way it happened. He was his administration, his Attorney General designate, his former Attorney General, are absolutely having the bejesus kicked out of them by the Democrats. That's when he gets this idea of let's get some dirt on them and go after them. So it was a reactive, in that sense, where this starts. He had a tip that Larry O'Brien and the Democrats were getting kickbacks in their convention. Kevin Phillips had provided this tip, and they thought it was worth exploring, and this is what they're looking for.
A Twitter question going back to the ideology of the Republican Party.
I should just also add one thing. He's a belts and braces type campaigner. Even when ahead, wants to make sure he's very ahead, wants that best landslide he can get.
Richard Nixon.
Nixon.
Mr. Dean, will the future of the Republican Party be determined by moderates like yourself remaining active in the party?
Well, I'm, of course, an independent. I can't tell you how many friends of mine who were very good Republicans, provided a lot of money to the Republican Party. They have decided that they're not comfortable with the Republican politics anymore. It's too bad. A lot of people in the business community feel that the Republicans are best for them. I'm not sure that's true, and there are many, many more just now declaring themselves independents and going where they think that they can best spend their money, because politics does require money. It's requiring increasing amounts of money. I thought it was wonderful when Obama was able to raise the kind of money he did through the internet. That's a great new resource. We'll see if it works again. The corporate United decision troubles me, because we don't want corporations being the backers for particularly our presidential elections.
You had left the White House after Spiro Agnew was forced out. Did that surprise you? Did you have any interactions with the vice president?
I did have interactions with him. In fact, he and I used to laugh, and I actually saw him after the fact. And he was going on an up escalator, and I was on a down escalator in Palm Springs, where he retired. And he and I sat down and he waved me to come back up, and I did. And we sat down for a while and we reminisced over our last visit, which was on one of the government's small planes, where we went. I think we were going to Chicago. They couldn't get the landing gear down, and we thought it might be our last flight. But I was fairly surprised that what happened to him. And of course, the timing was awful for Nixon. Just another thing in that period. People today can't appreciate how things disintegrated for Nixon, and that was just part of the picture.
Why Jerry Ford? Why did he select him?
The record indicates that he was the most strongly recommended by a broad spectrum of people. And I think Nixon also thought he was a pretty good insurance policy, because there wouldn't be a push while he was competent to be president, there wouldn't be a push to push Nixon out, because he had so little experience in foreign affairs. So he was there that if Nixon did have to leave or something did happen to him, here was a competent man, but they wouldn't want to shove him out just to get Ford in.
Tanya is joining us from Virginia Beach. Go ahead, please. Tanya, you with us?
Oh, yes.
Please go ahead.
So wonderful to talk to you, Mr. Dean.
Thank you.
And when I watched Watergate, I was in my early 50s. But one thing that I haven't heard anything about is Martha Mitchell, because I used to watch this program, and they were saying that she was drugged and kidnapped and sent to California because she was talking too much. Is that true?
No, she wasn't. She actually was in California when that incident happened. I liked Martha. I knew her well. I knew her from my time at the Department of Justice. She was a wonderful, charming personality, very Southern, always the life of a party. But unfortunately, she had a drinking problem. And when she had just a couple extra martinis, she'd get on the phone, and she was trouble. Most of the things she said were terribly exaggerated, and that was the sad part. But she's well remembered, and that's the nice part.
James is joining us from Oregon. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dean, for coming on C-SPAN, and also the time you spend going on to Randy Roadshow. I really appreciate that. But my question relates to your book, Conservatives Without Conscience, which is a fantastic book, and I really appreciate you writing it. I often ask my friends, like you say, you hear the same thing, you know, why don't they take the Republican Party back? And I wonder, you know, it seems that they have narrowed their focus on who can participate in their politics to the point to where, you know, I worry about them going away, which I think we need a conservative party, even though I'm a liberal myself. I appreciate the values and hold some of those myself, but I just wonder what your perception is where it's going. And then the last thing is, why, for the audience who hasn't read the book, why is it that liberals do not follow that same pattern of authoritarian follower? If you could just fill in the audience who hasn't read the book, and thank both of you for your time.
Right. Well, let me give you a good source that can give you a lot of answers on this. When I worked through Bob Altmeier's material, it was in its original academic form, and I had to have a copy of the Dummy's Guide to Statistics to get myself through all that material. When he realized I had become a serious student of his work, he was very helpful. At one point, I got to know him well enough. I said, listen, Bob, why don't you take your material and make a sort of a layperson's edition of it, and the fact that you know, everybody can then understand. He did, and he made it available for free. If you Google the authoritarians and put down for short Dr. Bob, rather than Altmeier's not a difficult name, but Dr. Bob will get you right there also. But you will get to his book. He lays an awful lot of the questions you raised out in that book. And I think that that's the fastest way to get you to some simple answers to a complex question.
This photograph during the Senate Watergate hearings, your wife Maureen seated almost directly behind you. How did that come about?
Well, she wasn't sure she wanted to go or not and attend them. My lawyer said, by all means, she said, well, I'm curious to know what's going on, so maybe I should go and I can follow the proceedings that way. What she didn't know is that the camera spent so much time on her, particularly the television camera. Television cameraman found a very pretty face, and she doesn't take a bad picture. So she was there, and it was nice having her there.
She wrote her own book about Watergate. What did you learn from her research on the book?
I think that probably you know, how hard it was on her. It was a very difficult thing. She was not a Washingtonian. She was not somebody who ever wanted to be a public person. And you were married for less than a year? Yes. We'd been dating for a while, but we had been married for a very short period of time. She is a very private person today, and does every, you know, as a result of being attacked by Liddy and the other revisionists, it's just driven her to be almost invisible. She doesn't want to see anybody, doesn't want to have any interactions with the public at all. And that's a shame, because she had a nice little, she was having fun doing Washington-type fiction and other fiction, but that ended when they drew her in as a Watergate participant when she's a total non-combatant. So she said, that's it for me for public life. I not want none of it.
Paul is joining us from Springvale, Maine. Go ahead, please.
John, I have to tell you that you may recall that in an article that Tom Wolfe wrote for Playboy, he said that who could ever have imagined that Richard Nixon would turn out to be Richard Nixon. I want to thank you for all of us for having been John Dean. We needed you then, and we need you now. And I've enjoyed your insights into the Washington scene for now coming up on 40 years. I have a couple of quick questions. I understand that there's an apocryphal story that in May of 1970, we went to DEFCON 1 during the Nixon administration, and there's nothing you can Google on it. I haven't been able to find it anywhere. Also, Bill Cohen, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, has also said the same thing about Cheney. Do you feel that we have missed an opportunity by not holding this last administration's feet to the fire? And finally, what's your take on Sarah Palin?
On DEFCON, I've heard the same thing. On Sarah Palin, I'm a spectator. I don't know. There are certain Nixonian qualities about Miss Palin, but that's still unfolding. The centerpiece of your question was, what was that? You don't remember either. It was the important part I was saving for last.
Paul, you still with us?
You there?
Yes, holding the administration.
Holding the Bush administration.
That's right.
Their feet to the fire over there, trampling.
Yes.
I'm going through some of the other email questions to get you ready. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, that's very important. And it's unfortunate it's not happened. It's very troublesome. I'm watching right now, as I'm sure you and others are, that we're seeing, because nobody is being held accountable, a total rewriting of what happened. Rove is doing it. Others are doing it. Rove is coming out and saying, well, yeah, waterboarding's fine. Well, these are horrendous war crimes, and they're going to write their own history of these events. So there won't ever be any accountability for these kinds of actions. They will be maybe given precedent that gives them a legitimacy. These, to me, they pale in comparison to Nixon's activities. While, yes, he did push the imperial presidency, while he, yes, used the presidency for political purposes, I can't imagine Nixon in his darkest moment permitting torture. I worked with him on the My Lai situation. He did that by the rules. But torture, we're talking, something as others get around the world as I do, is just absolutely having tremendously negative impacts on this country and its image. So it's a travesty. Not only, as I say, it's a very serious war crime. It also violates our Constitution. It's cruel and unusual. So I don't, the fact that Obama has decided, apparently, in his looking forward and not looking back, that he's going to give these people all a pass, I think we've left a very serious future problem to be dealt with.
Well, let me follow up, because from your book, Broken Government, you say, quote, conservative Republicans love to talk about checks and balances inherent in the separation of powers. They simply are not very good at employing them, for they have allowed their constant reach for power to dictate conduct, whether in or out of power.
Exactly the point. Exactly the point. They are good rulers. They're good at winning elections. They've gone to the extreme too now, and this is actually almost calls, as I was rereading, because I don't tend to reread my books, but I thought I ought to be familiar with them before we talked today. I was thinking and reading The Conservatives Without Conscience. That needs to be extended to explain, because it just flows right into the Tea Party movement, and how the problems that are there that are not recognized and are just being sort of brushed aside. I like to go where the mainstream tends not to go, and the fact that we're not dealing with torture is deeply disquieting to me, anyway.
Well, Franklin Ford, one of your critics, said this about Worse Than Watergate. He said it could have easily been transcended some of the limitations of the Bush-bashing genre. As many have noted, the anti-Bush books are on the bestseller list, and he wrote this back in 2004. They tend to stoke yellow dog Democrat anger without making any effort to persuade the undecided. Dean, however, could have written his book to appeal to the folks outside the liberal choir.
Well, that's one of the I thought I had reached. I didn't. I read that review and I scratched my head and I said, maybe he didn't read it as closely as I thought I'd written it, because that's part of the group I tried to reach, and I've tried to reach with all my books as being sort of a centrist myself, that it'll appeal to the others. So I didn't get it with his review, but I tend to look at reviews only when I'm writing my next book, to see what reaction they're having.
Thom is joining us from Nebraska. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful program. I asked Mr. Dean a question in South Dakota State University when he first spoke when his blind ambition was released then. It's an honor to speak with him. A couple quick questions. What is his impressions looking back now at Senator Sam Ervin? What is his thoughts about President Nixon's thoughts and efforts on health care? And lastly, just want to say, as a historian, history major, it irritates me when people discuss the Chicago corruption in the 1960 election. Kennedy would have won the election if Nixon had carried Illinois, which most people never seem to pay attention to. Thank you so very much for the program.
Thank you for the call. First, Sam Ervin.
Agreed on Sam Ervin was I think that it was a unique opportunity for him. He was a very colorful character. He was fair. He had the wisdom to hire Sam Dash, who put together a very careful set of hearings. They developed, basically all the information that gave the big picture. He educated the public as to the events. The prosecutor's files are just loaded with those hearing documents as to the basis of where they started. So he did all the groundwork to really uncover what was going on and why it was happening.
The other topic was health care.
Health care.
And as we've been seeing in this debate, there was a moment in the Nixon White House where we could have had health care.
Right. And Kennedy would later say that he wished he'd accepted Nixon's deal when he offered it, because we would have had health care a long time ago, before the late senator passed away. But that was in the domestic policy area. I had very almost incidental dealings with that. I'm just aware of the fact from some of the material in the White House that Nixon, who again was very progressive in a lot of his policies.
Well, you write in the book China and the EPA as two examples.
Exactly. They're wonderful examples of in fact, most conservatives are very uncomfortable with Nixon because he was considered by many the last liberal president.
We'll go to Phil, joining us from Baltimore with John Dean. Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Dean. I had a question. You did a lot of research about Deep Throat and about just the whole information that Deep Throat gave to Bob Woodward. I was wondering, it seems apparent in your discussions with Keith Olbermann and others that some amount of the information was actually, that Mark Felt gave to Bob Woodward, was actually emanating from the White House. And I was wondering if you were the person that was actually giving Mark Felt the information that Felt was giving to Woodward, or if it wasn't you, do you know who it might have been?
Yeah, I was gone by then. This is the information he gets from the White House is in November of '73. The book that you just saw there is one of several efforts to uncover Deep Throat. I don't know why I got fixated. It was a good mystery story in my book, Lost Honor. It weaves all through the book and composes the entire last chapter, where I came down and said Hague could be a potential, but I really couldn't sort it out. But I look at my methodology, and there was nothing wrong with it. The problem was the clues just couldn't take you to where you needed to go. And I think that Jim Mann, for example, a former Washington Post reporter who came as close as anybody to pinning Felt, did so based on his dealings with Woodward on the Wallace shooting, where Felt was indeed working with the White House. He was right there and helped a lot. So I think that helped man put together 2 and 2 and come up with he thought it had to be somebody in the FBI, and could well be Felt. So I wasn't his source in the White House. The part I was referring to on Countdown was the fact that the last story is about the fact that one or more tapes have an potential erasure on Nixon's secret tapes. In the Washington Post story, as opposed to the book, when you compare the two, all 5 sources in the Washington Post story are White House sources. When I've thought about that, since we now know it's Felt, it strikes to me that, and it seems to be the only piece of information that Felt gave to Woodward, is because Woodward doesn't know where Felt got this information. And it may have been that Felt said, listen, I heard from somebody in the White House, and I'll tell you how that could happen, that one or more of the tapes might have erasures. And then they got 4 other sources that sort of confirmed that. So they would legitimately all theoretically be from the White House. Now, what happened? When Rose Woods discovered that she had erased what she thought was 5 minutes, and it later turned out to be 18.5 minutes, I'm sure she talked to some of her friends in the White House, and there were people. There were a group of women down in the basement of the EOB who were all friends of Rose's. They would take assignments from her because there wasn't room over in the West Wing. They would do their work over in the EOB. The liaison guy for the FBI, a guy by the name of Haynes, is also down there, and he's very friendly with them also, because these are the same women, some of them, who do all of the clearance procedures for cabinet members and White House aides, and do all this sort of work. It could have very easily just come up in a conversation where one lady said to Haynes, God, we're now dealing with a potential erasure problem now that with the tapes have saved. And just in a passing comment, because Woodward doesn't seem to have much more. So I don't think it was much more. I certainly think Bob Woodward is an honest person. Don't think he's playing any games. I think if there's mistakes that Felt gave him, he gave him those for his own reasons. Maybe there are a few instances where Bob, because he wasn't taking contemporaneous notes, but rather writing things up afterwards, could have made a few minor mistakes. So that could explain some of the bad information. But I think we have the answer to that last remaining question. As far as the 18.5-minute gap, what's on there, we may someday have the computer technology to recreate that material, and we'll actually find out if there's anything of substance. I again think it's Nixon botching the machine and not trying to erase something that was horrifying.
Where physically in the West Wing was your office?
I was in 106 in the EOB. That is the south corner of the EOB. I look out over the ellipse, and the corner of the office looks out over the south lawn.
Have you been back to the White House since 1973?
I was by there yesterday.
Inside?
Not inside, though. And in fact, it took me an hour because of the Easter crowd and the cherry blossoms to get from Memorial Bridge to my hotel. It was a parking lot.
Let me go back to the Rehnquist choice. Abe Fortas, appointed by Lyndon Johnson. Explain why he resigned. Was he forced out? Were there dirty tricks at play? What was going on?
Yeah, I tried to explain in the Rehnquist choice how Nixon saw the potential to get appointees while he was still running for office. When, first of all, Earl Warren announced that he was departing, clearly seeing that Earl Warren not being somebody who trusted Richard Nixon, they'd been at it politically for years.
Both from California.
Both from California. And Earl Warren, a very savvy guy politically, and seeing it, thinking that Lyndon Johnson could fill the chair while he was, still there before Nixon could win the election to get inaugurated. It didn't happen. Nixon passed the word through Ehrlichman to Bob Griffin in the Senate, filibuster. Been a lot of comment the fact that there'd never been a filibuster by the Republicans of a Supreme Court nominee when there were threats of a filibuster during the Bush years, and some of the other times it's come up where it really starts with Nixon and Fortas. What Johnson was going to do was put Fortas in as Chief Justice, and then take Fortas as Associate Justice chair and put a guy by the name of Thornberry from Texas into that chair. So he would be putting, in essence, two people on the court because of the way the chairs were shuffling.
And this is 1968.
68, right, during the height of the campaign. So the filibuster prevents Fortas from getting the chair, and that kills the Thornberry. So Fortas stays seated. But meanwhile, Mitchell, and one of the things that comes up during the confirmation hearing, on a pure tip from somebody in Washington, is that Fortas has received outside income by teaching up at American University.
About $15,000.
About $15,000, which is about half of his salary as a justice. Here's a man who'd been making lots of money as a very successful Washington practitioner. Went on the court, and he's probably strapped, and he's got his wife who's in Fortas and Porter, or Porter, Arnold and Porter. Fortas was gone, and so she's working. And anyway, to cut that story to the bone, what Nixon picks up is that there's somebody else that is supplying money to Fortas, a fellow by the name of Wolfson, who's under indictment by the Justice Department. So they make what I read as a bluff play to force Fortas to retire. And they do it by threatening to open a new grand jury where they'll bring Fortas's wife and his partner, Paul Porter, before the grand jury and cause them who knows what kind of havoc. It's an investigation that Johnson's Department of Justice had looked at, settled. So Mitchell is reopening it, and it was clearly to me a ploy to force Fortas off the court. And then they were going to go after Bill Douglas and try to force him off. And when Douglas learned that, he just dug in and say, as long as I live, I'll be on this court, rather than give him the opening. So yes, there was that move, and I'm convinced that Fortas hadn't committed a crime, that he didn't want the grief for his wife. He could go back to private practice, and did, and that Nixon got a seat as a result of it.
Paul is joining us from Las Vegas. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Steve, and hi, Mr. Dean. Happy Easter. Steve, you do a wonderful job with the interviewing, both here and on Washington Journal. And Mr. Dean, I've read several of your books and enjoyed them very much. A quick story and a question. I'm usually successful in striking up conversations with seatmates on plane rides, but about 6 years ago, a beautiful woman sat down next to me, obviously very wealthy, and I was unable to get much of a conversation going with her. She was courteous, but quite distant. And I put that down later to the fact that I had a book on my lap, which I read from a little bit of, and that book, of course, was worse than Watergate. So, but my question was...
Well, Paul, who was your seatmate?
She was obviously a wealthy young woman from Seattle. It might have been a Microsoft millionaire's wife or somebody like that, but...
Those are my readers.
But, well, this one, I don't think she appreciated the book. It was just a guess on my part, but I think an educated guess. But in any event, I'd like to know your opinion on Bush v. Gore, if you haven't already discussed it. I missed the first half hour. And thanks again for a wonderful program.
Well, we haven't discussed it, so thanks for bringing it up.
It was a travesty. It was one of those decisions I think the court will... rue for a long time. It was pure judicial activism. It was the court reaching out to cut short the process that the founders certainly intended for the House of Representatives to resolve, not the court.
Do you think Al Gore ultimately would have prevailed?
Not necessarily, but I'm talking about the process. I don't know what would have happened. You never know what kind of deals can be made in the House. We have precedent for things being resolved by the people, if you will, rather than the non-elected judges. So it was a disruption of for a group of people who are originalists. They're creating their own original version of how to resolve a presidential election. I can understand, in another sense, why they did it, that they were afraid of the disruption that might have been caused by the delay in resolving it. But, you know, how many opinions have they written that they say are precedent for nothing?
This is from Jean. She says that she's from a Midwestern state. She said, I don't mean to make both of us feel old, but I was in high school during the Watergate hearings. She worked in state government for 23 years. And she said, I am disillusioned with, quote, the dream unrealized, that is, having a cadre of professional public servants that elevates the management and the analysis above the politico. And then she goes on to talk about campaign contributions influencing the process.
I was having dinner with friends last night with a local lawyer, and we were talking about how the special interests in this city have grown, and they have, I was saying, they have grown so exponentially in this city. The money in this city was a nice restaurant. We noticed everybody was comfortable. This city is not recession-proof because it has a steady employer in the government, and it has all these special interests who are taking and wining and dining people.
So it is recession-proof?
I think it largely is, the city itself. It affected real estate, but not if you run a good restaurant, it will stay full because of the business of the city. But to me, and it's something I've witnessed. I was on Capitol Hill before I went to the White House. I was in the Justice Department dealing with their legislative program. So I had the potential of dealing with lobbyists. They didn't deal with me because there weren't that many in those days. And so I've watched this growth from a good distance, but I've watched it steady. I've watched, I have a number of friends who work in law firms that do lobbying. I have former member of Congress friends who are delighted they got defeated because they're now making seven-figure salaries in this city, and it is corrupting the system. And as long as it happens, I mean, this isn't the way our democracy was designed. We're gaming the system, and we let the special interest take control. And you can't get elected today if you don't have somebody bundling the money for you, and you are beholden to that person. You might say you're not, but they sure as hell will get in your office fast when they want to. And it is something that we have to address.
A number of our viewers commenting on your appearances on MSNBC, and this is from John in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The essence of the question is, if Watergate happened today in the 24/7 cable environment, would things have been different?
There would have been a lot more of it. If you recall, those who are, I don't know how old John is, Watergate did get rather extensive coverage, and it was very interesting. When Watergate first occurred, when the Watergate break-in occurred in June 17th of 1972.
On a Saturday.
On a Saturday, late Saturday night. It is a non-story in the mainstream media until April of '73. The only paper that's covering it is the Washington Post, and they're keeping it a front page story. They didn't crack the story. What they did is they kept the pressure on during the whole period where judges are reading about it, prosecutors are reading about it, members of Congress are reading about it, because it's front page news in Washington. Inside the Beltway, it's a story. I've talked to George McGovern at length about this. He said, John, I couldn't get two reporters together in a room to talk about Watergate. I was convinced something was astray. And I would tell them about the Washington Post. They say no one cares outside of Washington. So there was no national attention until Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and yours truly were sent packing from the White House. And then the national media says, ooh, there must be something here. And at that point, it starts becoming a story. At that point, it starts becoming a headline every other day that are enormous, I mean, shattering headlines, that one topping another and another. The networks pick it up at that time, and it becomes nightly news. It's not a 2-minute segment, it's a 10, sometimes 30-minute segment. They're specials. So it did get covered. So I'm not sure that cable would have changed it much. I don't know. What would have been interesting would be that the president might have found a defender in Fox News, but he might have been too liberal for Fox News.
How were you fired on April 30th, 1973? What happened?
Well, what happened is the president had asked me to resign on April 16th. He had passed 2 letters across the desk. I read them and I said, Mr. President, you're asking me to confess to anything you want to put in these letters. And he said, well, why don't you take them and think about it? And I said, I'm happy to leave anytime, under any circumstances. I just think that you're not going to resolve this problem if Haldeman and Ehrlichman don't go too. I've listened to tapes of that period. And they chuckle how the fact that, you know, they're not going to go. Only this is when I begin to realize I'm being set up as a scapegoat. And a few days after that, I released a statement that I've only talked to the press once when I was in office. And that is, I had my secretary call to make a message I wanted to make sure that the president got, Haldeman got, Ehrlichman got, and anybody else got, that I didn't do the scapegoat role well. And I figured that was the best way to get the message to them. It did. So when I happened to have been in New York when he accepted or requested and accepted my resignation and declared Haldeman and Ehrlichman the 2 finest public servants he'd ever had to accept the resignation of. It's interesting, in writing his memoir, Nixon says, I'm the only one that tried to warn him. He said, Haldeman never came in, Ehrlichman never came in, and he realized with hindsight that I tried to warn him that he really had trouble.
This is the cancer in the presidency line.
The cancer on the presidency. And that was only my, we were just really starting to get into Watergate, and I just wanted to bring him up and make him know that he had a real problem.
We'll go to Steve, joining us from Rockville, Maryland. Welcome to In Depth on Book TV, Steve.
Thank you. Mr. Dean, I'd like to just ask you 2 questions. One is, with all the millions of man-hours and time spent on Watergate, there's never been an answer for, one, who directly ordered the break-in? They say Jeb Magruder, but everything I've read about Magruder is he's very passive and a follower and wouldn't have done it by himself. And the second is, why bug Chairman Larry O'Brien's office? I've never heard a credible explanation for that.
I hadn't either. I have gathered information over the years and just added a new 30,000-word edition called The End of the Story to Blind Ambition, where I was able to sift through the hard evidence, not what people remembered, not what they thought, but what actually happened. And what's clear is that Nixon created a situation where the only place they could get what they wanted was in the DNC. And Jeb Magruder did give the order.
Next is Dennis, joining us from Bethpage, New York. Welcome to the program. Go ahead, Dennis.
Speak to you, Mr. Dean. John Dean, yes. I hope I can get some time, because I do wait 30 days, as everybody should. I have an opinion of the Tea Party movement and the progressivism of the so-called progressivism of Mr. Nixon. The Tea Party movement, they're not Tea Partiers. It's a lynching party. It's racist, and it's one of the wings of the Republican Party. I call it the Republican wing. Then the other wing of the party is the Gopranos, G-O-P-R-A-N-O-S. And as far as Mr. Nixon, he was not a progressive. He had a Democratic Congress, which was probably very veto-proof. So I wouldn't give Mr. Nixon that credit. As far as his health care plans,
I believe he was going to do what Obama did today, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Well, let me just make one comment that on Nixon's progressivism, on domestic policy, what he did is he turned it over to his key domestic advisors, John Ehrlichman in particular, and said, just don't get me arrested. Do what you think is necessary and good politically. So a lot of the progressivism that is tagged to Nixon is actually aides. But you can't say that the China initiative was not progressive. That's the sort of thing that pre-Nixon conservatives and Republicans would dare never have done.
One of the names in Pure Goldwater, Hillary Rodham. What was the connection between Hillary Rodham and Barry Goldwater? And in the book, you also talk about a visit that she made in Arizona in 1996.
Right. Hillary Rodham was a Goldwater girl when she was growing up in 1964. She obviously, this was one of her first introductions to presidential politics. What I found interesting was there was I didn't put it in because the copyright belongs to Bill Clinton, but Bill and Hillary Clinton became close to Barry Goldwater in his retirement years. Bill Clinton and the president and Barry Goldwater talked on the telephone. They exchanged communications, and at one point Hillary visits him in Phoenix. Another point, Bill Clinton, I think, is one of the last people to see him when he's in the hospital. They liked him, and he liked them. When Hillary Clinton was being attacked by conservatives, Goldwater first sent a message to his colleagues back in Washington to back off. This was just uncalled for, and then sent another message to some local people who were, one was campaigning for Congress, I think, at the time, who was attacking Hillary. And what the funny outcome of this is that the Arizona Republicans came out to see the senator and said, listen, Senator, we don't know what you're doing, but what you're doing, you got to stop. You know, we built this big building downtown. It's the Barry M. Goldwater Republican headquarters of Arizona. You keep doing what you're doing with the Clintons, and we're going to take your name off that building. And the senator, of course, being the senator, said, you keep doing what you're doing, I want you to take my name off the building.
We'll go to Charles next from Kankakee, Illinois, with John Dean. Welcome to the program.
Hello. I'd like to ask Mr. Dean if he could comment on the Family of Secrets by Russ Baker, where he reiterates the charges that were in the lawsuit. Is a copyright 2009 book, if he's going to bring suit against him too.
I'm still looking at Mr. Baker. He's somebody I hold in minimum high respect because he's not a terribly solid journalist. So I'll just leave it at that.
Next is Marion from Erie, Colorado. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good morning. This is a wonderful program, and thanks to you both. I have a specific question, and it has to do with the Watergate tapes, and specifically a moment, and I've only read the transcript, so I'm asking Mr. Dean to flesh out this moment, where my picture, at least, is that President Nixon is sitting on one side of the desk and Mr. Dean is sitting on the other. And the president twice says, you realize that if one person tells this story, the whole thing could come down. And Mr. Dean says, yes, I know that. And the president reiterates this, and Mr. Dean says again, I'm aware of that, or words to that effect. It's been a while since I read it. And I'm wondering if at that moment, in that moment of conversation, whether you had the sense that he knew it was you, or whether you knew and he didn't, that it was going to be you. It's just such a Shakespearean, dramatic moment. At any rate, I'll hang up.
Thanks, Marion. We'll get a response.
You know, the best thing, it's actually, without listening to that particular segment of tape, it would be hard for me to give you a very accurate answer, and it may well be in the voice on the tape. You can actually listen to these tapes, it sounds like you're talking about the March 21st tape from the little bit I picked up, and there's some place, if you go to www.hpol, that's hpol.org, you can find tapes. There are a couple other sources that have them, but that's a good one.
We'll go to Bill joining us from Brookline, Massachusetts. You're next.
Hi, folks. How are you?
Good.
John, can you hear me?
Yes, we sure can. Go ahead with your question. Thanks for phoning in.
John, in the January 1980 issue of Harper's Magazine, a fellow by the name of Jim Hogan wrote an article called The McCord File, later expanded to a book called Secret Agenda. I guess the essence of the argument was that McCord sabotaged the break-in operation. Have you heard about the author of the book? Or
yeah, I have. I address. He's sort of the godfather of the Watergate revisionists. He was the first. He operated fairly early when the story of Watergate was quite familiar, and therefore was not as dramatic in changing it, but other revisionists who have followed has picked up where he left off. I explain in this new afterword to Blind Ambition how these revisionists accomplish their revisionism. So if you're interested in that, you can find it there. As far as McCord goes, he's placing McCord with a level of intelligence and cunning that I don't think McCord ever had. It would have been impossible for him to do. In fact, 90% of what Hogan is suggesting strikes me as highly improbable. So I think if you want to understand what these revisionists are doing, I tried to address that in doing this afterward to Blind Ambition.
Margaret joining us from Manchester, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Dean, you're one of my heroes in American politics, and it's a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
I've recently read a book called The 40 Years' War, whose subtitle is The Rise and Fall of the Neocons from Nixon to Obama, written by Len Kolodny and Thom Shachtman. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm familiar with I've not read the book. I'm familiar with the writers. They were defendants in my lawsuit. And I find them dubious in their authenticity.
I wondered about them because I had never come across them until I saw them on book notes, as a matter of fact, one weekend, and I delved into their book. So my question really was all the plots and intrigue that they described.
You have no idea what this man Kolodny can concoct. He has never seen two people together he's not convinced are deep into some national conspiracy.
Let me go back to Bob Haldeman. He wrote a diary, an almost daily diary that totaled about 75,000 words. Have you read that?
Mm-hmm.
What surprised you, or what did you learn?
It's a wonderful book. What's interesting is, because he was worried about the prosecutors getting that material, he put it with the presidential papers, and it was therefore protected. Clearly, it was probably an obstruction of justice doing it, because he had a subpoena requesting a lot of that information that could have answered a gazillion questions during Watergate. It comes out, as you know, long after the fact. His discipline in doing it is remarkable. He does it virtually from day one until his last day there. It's varying degrees of length. I think he did it particularly he realized after they put the taping system in, they needed some way to get back into this material, and these little summary notes would be very helpful. It also is quite revelatory in, for example, no one was ever sure if John Mitchell had actually admitted to anybody he had authorized the Watergate break-in. He, on March 28th of 1973, he admits it to me. He's doing it to put pressure on me to get to lie. He's taken me off into another office to have that conversation. That same day, he admits the same thing to Bob Haldeman, and Haldeman puts it in his diary. So there's little things like that that those of us who understand the implications of some of this material, that would pass the normal reader. But, you know, there are lots of little nuggets like that in that book, which makes it a very important book.
One timeline question. You're appointed as the counsel to the president July 1970.
Right.
September of 71, just about 14 months later, you're thinking of leaving.
Yes.
Bob Haldeman has a conversation with you, but what
Yes.
happened?
Well, I'd been on vacation. I'd been thinking about it. A couple things were at play there. I never asked Senator Goldwater to help me find a job anywhere. But once I'd taken the job at the House Judiciary Committee, he said to me one night, "You got to promise me something. You got to promise me you'll start your way out of government and be out within your 5th year." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well," he said, "I've just seen too many guys come here, go to work, never leave. It's awful easy to stay. You've got a lot of potential. You got to get out." And I said, "Done. I'll promise you that." My 5th year came up then, but something else had come up. This is the year, 71, is when the Pentagon Papers were leaked. Those of us who've gotten together in the years since have realized that this is when everything changes at the Nixon White House. It really, the lights go out, it gets dark, it really is not a very pleasant place to work. Nixon's mood changes, everybody's mood changes. And so after getting out and taking a brief vacation in September, I came back and I said, it's time to leave. So I went in to see Bob Haldeman. I said I had stopped in New York and because I'd had some inquiry, had a couple of very nice job offers that intrigued me. One was to become a short-term assistant or deputy general counsel and then be boosted up to general counsel of a worldwide shipping line. And the other was a Wall Street job that as an investment banker that intrigued me very much. Both out of politics, something I wanted to do, something different. And I explained that to Haldeman, and he said, "John, you can't leave. You owe it to us to stay. You leave, you'll burn your bridge with us. You need to keep that bridge open. And after it's over, you're even going to get better offers." Didn't mention it might be making license plates somewhere, but he really, in essence, said you can't leave and you're going to hurt yourself if you do. I suspect years later he wished he'd let me go. But it was that two things, the fact I had told the Senate I was not going to spend a long time in government, and the fact that I had not liked the mood and change and the nature. This is right after I'd flown out in July to turn off the Brookings break-in. Jack Caulfield shows up in my office one day and he says he's been ordered by Colson to break in and firebomb the Brookings Institute. I said, "Jack," I said, "that's insane." I said, "Don't do anything." And I flew to San Clemente, got Ehrlichman to turn it off, and came back. Krogh comes back and says, "Well, John, there are a lot of people who think you're a little old lady around here. I can't even tell you what they've asked me to do." It was set up the plumbers. So I knew it was time to leave. I thought it was time to leave.
Did you ever apologize to your friend Barry Goldwater about being caught up in Watergate? Did you ever have a conversation about your role specifically?
It was never appropriate to apologize. He always said to me, in fact, I think I recounted in something, that after Watergate, he and I are out with his son and his wife and my wife and Barry Jr. and his wife on his boat out of Newport. And he's saying that we're up at the helm, and he's saying, "John," Barry Jr. was there also, He said, you know, I've looked at this, I'm pretty aware of what happened. You're the only person, I think, that deserves to come out smelling like a rose. You did the right thing. I know you didn't want to blow the whistle. You try. What few appreciate is that I actually had a plan that I thought if I broke rank, I could force others to do so. They too would come forward. They'd tell the truth, and this could potentially save Nixon. Nothing short of that was likely to save him. You just couldn't keep a cover-up going. You couldn't get up with a half-truth. It just needed to be laid out. I'm convinced to this day that's the only answer. And had he done it sooner rather than later, had he done it in the March 21st cycle, he might have survived.
Margie is joining us from Macomb, Georgia. Go ahead, please.
Hi, it's Nathan. Good morning, Mr. Dean. I've got a couple of things to ask you. The Supreme Court has ruled that our news stations can lie to us, and they do a lot of times. They never told us that Georgia started that war, which a Republican burst out in a hearing, and and I also watch BBC and several other news channels. But my question to you is, a lot of the Republicans will be in a hearing and hear something straight out, and then be on C-SPAN the next day going, we need oil refineries, we're out of oil refineries, and then the other day, the lady's on there going, who ever said we needed oil refineries? And in the hearing that they had, when the Republicans came out and said that, they said, no, it's not that. It's speculation. My question is, my dad's a lawyer. These people are representing us. Should there be some law where they can't lie to the people they're representing and they tell us things that aren't true, that are against our interests, that are hurting the people that need it most, like...
One of the saddest things that I've seen happen of late, politicians have been known to spin information. This is not new. What is new, in fact, it was so troubling to me that I had to address it head on. It's an intellectual dishonesty that I think is going to have serious reverberations for conservatives. It's happening too often. I'm seeing it. I saw it first with this Watergate revisionism. I also saw it in documents like the torture memos that were written by John Yoo. I've seen it in some of his books. In fact, in writing Broken Government, it got so bad at one point I decided to write an appendix to show people the sorts of activities that are being undertaken by people who know better. And staying with John Yoo for a minute, this is a very intelligent man. This is a man who clerked for Lawrence Silberman at the U.S. Court of Appeals, went on to clerk for Clarence Thomas, was the counsel of the House or Senate Judiciary Committee, is now a Berkeley professor, very prolific writer, and he is distorting information in a very dishonest way. And I think that to do that, to make a point, and to try to do it for political purposes is very dangerous. And I certainly hope Republicans and the authoritarian Republican, at least, the authoritarian conservative Republican, gets off this kick, because it's going to backfire on them.
You wrote in the book on Warren Hardin some of the parallels between the Teapot Dome scandal and Watergate. What were they?
Well, there's first of all, of course, it's the first time we have a special prosecutor. We get in Teapot Dome, too. I want to caveat your mention of Teapot Dome and Harding with the fact that Warren Harding has nothing to do with it. That's one of the great travesties, that he's been tagged with Teapot Dome when it happens after it's totally away from him. The one time he learns the scandal, he deals with aggressively, but yet he bears the burden of Teapot Dome.
And he dies before he can defend himself.
But Teapot Dome is a pure corruption scandal, and the only parallel, really, the strongest parallel, is the use of the special prosecutor. They selected two of them by the Department of Justice. The Attorney General selected two. In fact, I've read memo by the Watergate prosecutors drawing on many of the precedents that were established under Teapot Dome. It shows we have a remedy less than having to have an independent counsel law that can be used and can be set up, and I think sometimes should. I'm one, for example, who doesn't understand why we're not dealing with torture that way. I mean, these are very serious crimes. They're war crimes, and they're not going to go away. There are foreign governments right now investigating at least 7 former Bush officials, and if we don't do so, they could well be, you know, they certainly aren't going to travel abroad, for one thing, but certainly they could be theoretically tried in absentia of crimes.
So how do you think history will judge George W. Bush?
Obviously, history, Nixon's famous line that it depends on the historian who writes the history will make the judgment. Collectively, I think that he's in for trouble. I think that he gave too much power in the first 6 years of his 8-year presidency to his vice president. His vice president had an agenda that was to try to overturn anything that was a result of Watergate. These very aggressive actions in the name of fighting terrorism went way over the top, keeping Americans frightened to get the mandate to do so, are troubling historical potentials. They've never been accountable for many of the activities they've undertook. The fact that we went to war in Iraq on a really a bogus reason, those all need to be addressed and will be addressed, and I don't think history is going to be real good to either Bush or Cheney.
Our last call comes to us from Killeen, Texas. Kirby, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hey, guys, you're doing a good job down there today. It's very entertaining. John Dean, I first met you in 1976 when you came to Alfred University in upstate New York. You were either hawking your book or something. But anyhow, I was superintendent of schools in the area, and I sat among about 500 people. And I think most of them wanted to hang you because of what you did to President Nixon. Now, they perceived it that way. I'm not accusing you. What the question is, and I have 2 of them, how could you remain so calm? That is the biggest impression I have of you that night. You seemed so serene, and I thought, this man has been through hell, and look what he's doing here. He's doing a very calm presentation. I don't know how you did that.
Well, the truth does set you free.
Yeah, that's true. The other question, and I really want you to elaborate on this, give me a personal review of what I think is the most fascinating person of the Nixon administration, and that's John Ehrlichman. What was he really like as far as you're concerned?
Well, John was very bright. He was basically a real estate lawyer who came into the administration because he'd been in the advance operation. He was a classmate of Bob Haldeman's, the chief of staff. He'd worked during the campaign. He was very bright. He loved domestic policy. That's where he quickly moved from the counsel's chair to become the assistant to the president for domestic affairs, and did a remarkably good job. He was very progressive in his policies, and he was politically sharp. John's mistake was that he made a lot of enemies in Washington when he was here. He was abrupt. He didn't have a very good manner with some people. And when he needed help, when he got himself in trouble, he had a reservoir that was pretty deep of ill will from which to draw from, and drew deeply. He made some serious mistakes. He thought he could order a break-in into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist because the president wanted it without getting explicit directions from the president to do so. He'd go to jail for that. He got involved up to his eyeballs in the Watergate cover-up because he'd ordered the Ellsberg break-in. People should understand that the cover-up of Watergate was largely the cover-up of what had happened before Hunt and Liddy and their friends had gone over to the re-election committee, and they were being protected for what they'd done while working in the Nixon White House.
There is one moment that is captured in the Frost-Nixon movie, and of course from the original interviews, and that's when David Frost basically said to Richard Nixon, "Why don't you apologize to the American people?" I'm paraphrasing, but he never did so. Why?
I don't think he ever thought he'd really done anything wrong. I mean, that based on the few people I know who had informal, relaxed conversations with him, he thought that was a sign of weakness. He thought he hadn't done anything wrong. And he made some sort of generic, "I've made mistakes" type comments, if you recall. They were mistakes not of the head, but of the heart. So he made justifications and rationalizations, and that's about as far. That's one of the reasons he could have never met with me or dealt with me, because he just wasn't good at that sort of thing. I hope he apologized to his family, though.
You also wrote in the updated edition of Blind Ambition that had the Republicans controlled this town, the House and the Senate, the hearings never would have happened.
Absolutely right. No question, Watergate was very political. No question. What would have happened is there would have been some perfunctory action. There might not have even. What it's difficult to figure out is how far the U.S. attorney might have taken things. One of my thoughts in coming forward was it would be handled in front of a grand jury, remain secret forever, and Nixon would survive. I didn't look to shoot down Nixon. He decided to pick the fight. He just happened to pick the fight with the wrong guy, and the rest is, my remembering. I believed I was taped and things like that resulted in. I got lucky, if you will. Otherwise, it could have been very different. But had Congress not put the pressure on, Nixon would have done all 8 years.
What's your next book?
I've not really talked, and still am not going to talk about a look my publisher convinced that I should take of Richard Nixon. I've never really written about Nixon. He's only been in passing. He comes up in his many flavors and remarkable profile of Nixon in the Rehnquist choice. I really enjoyed rereading that because I saw Nixon being strong, decisive. I saw him being comedic when he didn't even know he was being funny. I saw him being comedic when he knew he was being funny. I saw him making good decisions. I saw him making bad decisions. It's just a microcosm of his presidency. But there are lots of issues that need to be tucked away, and there's some outstanding large issues that aren't mysteries, but just large issues that need to be put to rest. And I'm in a unique position to do it, and my publisher knows that. So then I can put, hopefully, Watergate on the shelf, because this has been my planned avocation for my retirement. I'm having a lot of fun with it. Book a year is a little bit much, but we enjoy cranking them out. We being my wife giving me the tolerance to let me disappear up into my office to crank these things out, and it keeps you mentally active.
And finally, who in history intrigues you the most?
Who in history intrigues me the most? That's a very tough question. I read about the presidents, all the 43 past presidents now, and I've always enjoyed a couple of those in particular. I've liked Washington, Lincoln, FDR, and it'd be a toss-up as to who I'd put on the top of the list as the one I would most enjoy reading about.
John Dean, thank you for spending 3 hours here on Book TV in depth. We appreciate it.
I thank you for your delightful questions.
By the way, this program will re-air at midnight tonight, 9 o'clock for our viewers on the West Coast, and also a rebroadcast here on C-SPAN 2 next Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for your phone calls, your emails, and your Twitter comments. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You'll have another chance to see In Depth with author and former White House Counsel John Dean in its entirety next Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern here on Book TV.
Or is it an ideology?
It's both. It is at least an ideology. One of the things I tried to do in that book was to get a good definition, a good working definition of conservatism. And I talked to, I can't tell you how many conservatives. I looked at the work of conservative intellectuals, and if there's anything they seem to agree upon, particularly the more intellectuals, is that you can't define adequately conservatism. And so they don't try to do so. Bill Buckley has thrown out some rather obtuse definitions. Other scholars have raised the problem of the difficulty of defining it. Barry Goldwater actually is somebody who cranked out 3 columns a week for 4 years for the LA Times, came up with a good, certainly for a politician, working definition that he thought was where it's drawing on the values of the past, the best of them, and applying them to the present. But he never really did come up with a totally satisfactory definition. But it became a movement. There's no question. Those aren't incompatible, that you don't have a definition, but you develop a movement, because I think it's, as much as anything, an attitude. In the book, for example, I try to give a broad spread for people, particularly those who don't know anything about conservatism. Most conservatives I talk to, agree with this, the difficulty of defining it. But there are, I think it more of an attitude in many regards and an approach than an ideology. So I don't think it has the typical traits of an ideology, but the movement obviously is something that has gained steam since the 50s and is still evolving as we see it in its latest iteration in the Tea Party movement.
Our conversation, 3 hours in depth here on C-SPAN 2's Book TV with John Dean, who served as counselor to President Nixon, has written 10 books, and will be with us to take your phone calls, 202-737-0001 if you live in the Eastern and Central time zones. And for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. Our email address is booktv@cspan.org, and you can join the conversation online at twitter.com. Let's talk about Watergate. Well, let's actually go back to the moment that you were asked to serve as counselor to the president. Was it a job that you wanted?
I was totally surprised. Bud Krogh, who worked for John Ehrlichman, asked me to come over to the White House, and we ended up walking around by the ellipse, and he said, Ehrlichman has moved out of the counsel's chair, and there's a big discussion internally in the White House about who's going to become the counsel, and I've been asked to ask if you are interested in the job. I said, well, it's obviously a great job, Bud, but I had a lot of friends, including you, at the White House, and you guys, you work around the clock and you see very little satisfaction. I'm over at Justice. I enjoy my job. I happened at that point to know about where I stood in the Department of Justice. They have something called, we saw it in 9/11 actually, when there's a threat to the government, there's our emergency government procedures, and you can all get whisked off into great caves at the top of the Department of Justice. And when I looked at the memo describing where I was in the ranking, I realized if 12 persons in the office didn't make it, I would become Attorney General. So I was ranked number 13th at a fairly young age. And John Mitchell had told me, he said, you're going to get, there are going to be higher options for you here at the Justice Department. When I mentioned the feeler to both Mitchell and Kleindienst, they both discouraged me from going to the White House for that very reason. They said, we'd like to keep you here at the department. We like your work, and we think you'll find yourself going up the ladder.
What was the relationship like between John Mitchell and Richard Nixon over the years?
At that point, it was very close. Mitchell had been Nixon's law partner in New York. They had been in two firms that have merged. They met. Nixon liked Mitchell. That's why he had become the campaign manager in the '68 race. He found that Rehnquist was my candidate because I knew Bill. I knew his conservatism. I knew why he believed the way he did. I was frankly later shocked to the degree of his conservatism, and I thought he would actually be a little bit more moderate on the court than he turned out to be. But that's another story. But there was a right time, and I suggested to several staff. Then I happened to mention another guy who just happened to walk into Nixon's office, and he is selected, and he's got in his mind Howard Baker and Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell would, of course, be nominated, but Howard Baker is dithering. He can't decide whether he wants to go on the court or not. Howard Baker, for listeners who might have forgotten, was the minority leader of the Senate, a fairly young minority leader at that, and somebody who Nixon thought would make a good justice, and probably would have. But we later learned that Baker, he had kids he had to put through college. He was worried about the finances of a job like that, which still doesn't pay well. It's a real sacrifice for a lot of men to go on the high court. So I had suggested Rehnquist to Dick Moore. Dick Moore happens to go in and get into a conversation with Nixon, who at this point is holding this very close to the chest. And so Rehnquist, the name gets thrown in. And while he's been thinking about it, it's not until Richard Moore mentioned something I'd mentioned to Moore that Rehnquist had clerked as a law clerk for Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson is a great justice by any partisan's definition, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Nixon recognized that. That seemed to close the deal. Suddenly he's not very interested in Baker. And then when he learns that Rehnquist, they thought, was number 2 in his class, again, Moore had that wrong. He was number 1 in his class. And Nixon had been beat up a little bit for some of the people he suggested along the way. So that was a fascinating story to put together how Rehnquist did get the nomination. The problem with the book, and the last end of the book, is Rehnquist was never vetted for the job. And that created its own set of problems.
And yet, in one reference, you or somebody else describes Rehnquist as a clown based on his attire.
Nixon. That's Nixon. That's a much earlier situation. After the Pentagon Papers were released, it brought to Nixon's mind again the fact that there's so much overclassification of documents in government. He wanted to create a pretty high-level group that would address and tackle the problem of declassifying papers. So what he did is he selected a small panel, put Bill Rehnquist in charge of that. He'd never met Bill Rehnquist, and we were having a conference in the outer office of his executive office building in their conference room. He comes in because he wants to charge the group up and tell him what he's got in mind, why he wants these papers declassified. And Rehnquist does a little talk and so on and so forth. And on the way out, the president signals me to follow him. And he says to me, he said, "John, who's the clown who's leading the meeting?" And I said, well, I don't know what you mean, Mr. He said, well, he knows I'm a little baffled by he thinks he's a clown. Well, he's got these long, at that point he had very long sideburns, and he was wearing hush puppies. We hadn't seen a lot of hush puppies in the corridors of the White House. And so, and Bill wore some of the worst neckties I've ever seen. Obviously it helped him wearing robes a lot when he was a judge, because they just seemed to be clashing choices, and so Nixon reacted to that. And he also said, "Is he Jewish?" And I said, "No, Mr. President, I think he's Scandinavian." And he shook his head and he just kind of walked off in his office. And he couldn't remember his name after that. He comes up later and he calls him Rehnquist or something like that. And Ehrlichman at that time, who was one of his classmates at Stanford, corrected him. So he didn't know well the man he appointed, and probably, I think, when he left the presidency, thought that might have been one of his greatest decisions.
In the book, Conservatives Without a Conscience, is conservatism a movement?
I was very surprised with. It's the subject his diary got the most attention for. So it made an interesting work to put it together, given the fact it was so original.
I want to get to the Nixon material in just a moment. Just to put it in context, Barry Goldwater elected back in 1952. He ran for the presidency and so gave up his Senate seat in 1964, and then came back in 1968, was elected, and served for another 18 years.
Right.
But he ran in 1964 knowing that he was going to lose to Lyndon Johnson. Why?
A matter of principle in many regards. He he had been visiting the South, giving a lot of speeches in the South, realized there was a whole body of thought down there and a number of people whose views weren't really getting expressed through the Democratic Party at that time. They liked him, he liked them, and he thought it was time for the Republicans to make some serious inroads into the South. The part his diary is the weakest on is the material regarding the '64 campaign. That's the smallest bit of the material. In fact, we found some letters. We decided not to use the letters because they weren't quite the same as the diary entries. Just a few of those where he was a little bitter at the end. He thought that the press treatment was pretty rough in '64. If you recall, there was a lawsuit that he was provoked after '64 because a group of psychiatrists got together and polled. There was one person polled all psychiatrists, and they said he was psychologically unfit to be president. He didn't much take to that, so he decided to file a defamation suit. And I used a little bit of the deposition in that case in the book because, again, it was pure Goldwater coming out. So I think he ran in '64, to answer your question, to make some points, to lay a predicate for what would later become the conservative movement and would be followed up by Ronald Reagan. And without Goldwater in '64, you wouldn't have had Ronald Reagan later.
You compare the style of Richard Nixon after he lost in 1962 when he ran for governor of California to the statement of Barry Goldwater in 1964. And in the statement he said, quote, "I'd never seen or heard in my life," going back to the issue of the media, "such vitriolic, unbiased attacks on one man as had been directed to me. I've never in my life seen such inflammatory language as been used by some men who know better. I think these people, for their frankly, shoddy behavior, should hang their head in shame because I think they've made the Fourth Estate a sorry, sad mess."
I think the only thing that would differ from what Nixon said is you don't have Barry Goldwater to kick around anymore. He didn't add that. He was very, very upset. In fact, he famously said, you know, if I had to vote for the Goldwater who was portrayed in the media in '64, I wouldn't have voted for him. He said, that wasn't me. I didn't recognize the character that the media portrayed. So he had a very tough time in '64 with the media, and he was provoked at that post-election press conference to lay it out for what it was.
He loved his typewriter, didn't he?
He loved it was actually a little portable typewriter. He would take it out on his camping trips with him. Typed pretty well, but we had found a few errors we had to correct. But he actually it got much fuller when he was able to dictate.
There are two entries I want to ask you to elaborate on. One is from January 27th, 1971. And he's writing about Richard Nixon. This is in his diary, not a letter to the then president. "Looking back over the past several months, I continue to be amazed at the ineptitude that President Nixon has shown in the operation of government. This amazes me because if there is a politically astute animal in American politics, it is Dick Nixon," said Barry Goldwater. "I believe the trouble to be in that he has allowed himself to be surrounded by people who really aren't too smart in the field of politics, so he does not know what is going on."
He shared with his diary his thoughts, many of which he had actually shared with the president in some of their conversations. He stayed with Nixon, as we all know, right up until the end, and then some. After Nixon went to San Clemente, and he would go out and visit him in San Clemente, trying to see how his temperature was.
The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion with author and former White House counsel John Dean. Join us as In Depth welcomes the author of 10 books, including Lost Honor, Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush, and Pure Goldwater. His most recent book is an updated edition of Blind Ambition, The White House Years.
John Dean, among your 10 books, Pure Goldwater, co-written by Barry Goldwater's son. And in the book, you compare Barry Goldwater to Harry Truman. How so?
Well, he's one of those guys who has, over the years, his positions have gotten forgotten, his specifics, and he's really become to be viewed by partisans on both sides as somebody who was really a straight shooter, who told it the way it was, who had the respect of a wide spectrum. And I think as history has passed, he is in that category, regardless of whether you agreed or disagreed with him at the time. You look at him now as somebody who really had the best interest of the country in mind and spoke his mind, and that has a certain charm and certain good reception with the average voter. So I think there's a nice comparison.
And as you write, admired for his principles, is there somebody on the national stage today that is a Barry Goldwater?
I'm looking for him. I'm not sure there is. There are people who speak their mind, but he became a unique figure in American politics because of his outspokenness and his. He took a very unpopular position at the time. Conservatism was very young when he started a movement and made it very sensible. It was very common sense conservatism. We don't have somebody who's starting a movement quite like that I see today. At least hasn't surfaced on my radar.
When did you first meet Barry Goldwater?
When I was 13 years old. His son and I were roommates in prep school. We would travel up here to Washington from Stanton, Virginia, where we were in school. We would visit with him. It was very impressive. You know, here was this very tall, handsome figure who you'd walk down the Senate corridors with him, and he'd be kind of create a wake with the various police people and other people giving him way. He'd take us around the Senate. He drove a 1957 at that time Thunderbird that was geared up like it was the cockpit of an airplane. It had more gadgets and stuff. So for teenage boys, and being a teenager, he was a man's man and a great figure and a very charismatic person for a young guy.
One of the other words that comes up a lot in Pure Goldwater is honesty. Explain.
Well, Pure Goldwater, to put it in context, is just that. I'd read the senator's autobiographical works where he had worked with co-authors, and I don't think they ever found this material. And years later, in talking to him, he had told me he'd taken a lot of material that he had composed over the years and put it in the Arizona Historical Foundation. I hadn't seen that in his books, and when he and I were going to do another project, I looked at that and realized at that time, I said, you know, there's really good stuff in here, and it is pure Goldwater because it's not by a speechwriter, it's not by a staff person, it's the senator, and it goes from everything from a personal diary he kept starting when his son died, or excuse me, when his son was born, until his own death. And it's not regular, but it's enough of it that you really get a sense of the man through a lot of years. It's very personal. He hammered it out on a little portable typewriter when he was first starting it. Later, when electronic dictation became available, he would dictate it and it would be transcribed. And it wasn't well filed initially, but the archivist got it in order. And when I looked at it, I said to Barry Jr., I said, you know, this tells more about your dad, I think, in many ways than the autobiographies he's done. And it is, you know, we get his sense of humor, we get his position on various figures in politics. The surprise to me was the depth of the material on Nixon I found in the book, and it's very late in the game that Barry Goldwater finally breaks rank with Richard Nixon, because Nixon is really trying to cause a hard time for Jerry Ford when Ford was going to run for president. And Goldwater got disgusted. He said, you know, this man's been lying to me for a long time, and I've had it. And they just broke, and after that, there was never any relationship further.
In a letter that he wrote to Richard Nixon, June 20th, 1973, still very much supportive of the president, he began by saying, "Dear Mr. President, frankly, I think I should start over by saying, Dear Dick, because I'm writing to myself, as you will quickly detect." And it was a letter that he penned on his typewriter, talked about the people surrounding him in the White House, and also said, you need to come to Congress. People in Congress need to know that their president is listening to them. He also mentions Watergate in this letter. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, that was a private letter he typed out, literally at his apartment, and got it to the president. He did not get a response to it. So it was not a successful effort. At that point, Nixon had withdrawn pretty deeply into himself, and I'm sure someone like Al Haig looked at that letter and said, well, that's just going to upset the president worse. We better not get that in.
And it's a long letter.
It is a long letter, and it lays out a lot of thoughts. And he was, Goldwater at that point is trying to give the president his seasoned advice of how to proceed. But those of us on the other side and know that part of the story realize that Nixon knew by then there was very little he could do to salvage the situation.
In your book, The Rehnquist Choice, you write that more than any other president since FDR, he, Richard Nixon, worked hard to mold the court to his political liking. How did the Rehnquist decision fit into that?
Well, of course, the Rehnquist book, I hadn't reread it. I decided, having done a book for Brian Lamb on this show, the Harding book, and he caught me on a fact I couldn't remember. I should actually reread my books before I visited with you. I did, and I really enjoyed the Rehnquist book because it's a book that disappeared. It came out the week before 9/11. And as a result of not having Osama or terrorism in the title, like all books at that time, just disappeared. Maybe one of my best books. It's the one that historians write me the most about because it's based literally on the tapes that occurred in the Oval Office between Nixon and people talking about the staff. And when I'm not in there or others are not in there, I was able to put together a remarkable story, which is very timely now because we're about to the potential is very real. We're going to put another justice or two on the court. In the fall of '71, Nixon has 2 seats to fill. And the story I tell, and call it the Rehnquist Choice, a little bit for a literary device, because Rehnquist doesn't come up until the very end of the book. He is selected in the last 24 hours of the process, much to Rehnquist's surprise, who was doing at Justice somewhat what I was doing at the White House. He was developing candidates. He was doing preliminary vetting. The White House was getting upset with the fact they were being sent candidates like Hainsworth and Carswell, who were rejected by the Senate, were not well vetted candidates. So the White House and Ehrlichman, my predecessor as White House counsel, had gotten into it. The president had gotten into it. But it was still pretty much Mitchell and Nixon. And Barry Goldwater, for example, called in at one point. He can't remember Rehnquist's name, but he said, there's this guy you've got working for you, Mr. President, who's the president's lawyer who you should think about. Nixon understands who he's talking about. So he's dropped in, but it's ignored. Rehnquist is selected because I happen to have worked at the Department of Justice, too. Nixon was desperate to find a true conservative to put on the court, and they were scrambling. It shows the, as refined as you might think that process is, it's a lot of catch as catch can. It's a lot of who's available, who can we get confirmed at a given time. So this book sort of walks a reader through how that process unfolded with a record the likes of which we'll never have, because no president's ever going to tape again. But anyway.